You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at a talk given by Grady McMurtry, who rather famously had a live debate with Aaron Ra in which he was thoroughly humiliated. Here he is talking unopposed and spouting some serious nonsense. On the technical side, this video was uploaded in 7 separate parts, none over 10 minutes, and with some rough editing. It was also uploaded in 360p. I have re-edited it to make it slightly less jarring, and the low resolution is also why you'll see a border around the video. That being said, let's hear Grady tell us all about evolution and see how long he goes before getting something badly wrong.
I'm Dr. Grady McMurtry with Creation and Worldview Ministries in Orlando, Florida.
Florida man confirmed.
I used to be an evolutionist, but today I'm a creationist.
How hard can I possibly hold down that X button? Further, evolutionist isn't really a thing, but I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be the last time McMurtry uses a word in a way that doesn't make sense, or uses a word that doesn't really exist.
I was raised on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley as an evolutionist, taught evolution from the 7th grade to the university level.
Why do I feel like he's conflating evolution with just science he doesn't like?
But during all that time of being taught evolution, I was never taught that this was a perfectly valid scientific alternative to the various theories of evolution.
That's because there isn't, and there's only one theory of evolution. The theory of evolution. Or if you want to go deeper into it, you could call it the modern synthesis.
The various theories of evolution declare that the Earth and the universe are billions of years old.
No, that's geology and astronomy, not evolution. I guess I was right. He's conflating evolution with just science he doesn't like.
Evolutionists say that we are just the result of a cosmic accident, that we are just thinking animals with that specific design or purpose. In school, most of us were taught that life began by random chance chemical reactions.
I certainly wasn't taught that, which is good, because that's not what science says. Chemical reactions aren't just random. Chemistry is largely deterministic. That's why people can design new chemicals and then reliably synthesize them, given the right equipment. Now, in nature, which molecules will encounter which other molecules is closer to random, but still, that doesn't make abiogenesis just random atoms and molecules flying at each other until a cell forms.
Yet when we see the beauty of the Earth, we see the complexity of the living organisms that occupy it. Can we really believe that this is all just an accident?
I don't know what accident means in this context. There's plenty of evidence that it's naturally occurring. Is a landslide an accident? What about a thunderstorm? I don't know. Accident just doesn't mean much outside the realm of conscious actors, because it means an event unintended by the actors involved in the surrounding action. And so to call life an accident requires intentional actors who did not intend life but got it anyway. If there are no such actors, then it doesn't really make sense to call life an accident. It's just what happened. If there are actors with some volition antecedent to life, then most people would probably think that life was intentional, even if it formed naturally. For instance, if there's a god, that god created the universe to be able to harbor life in it, at least in some corners of it, and so life came about naturally, but was still intended. Also, if you're playing bingo, feel free to check the complexity and things are cool, therefore God boxes.
Throughout the world, we are presented with the evidence that calls into question evolutionary beliefs and the assumption of an old age for the Earth and the universe.
I've yet to see it, and based on this guy's performance against Ra, I feel like we're not going to see it in this video.
Over the course of this program, we will present to you evidence that will shake the foundations of the evolutionary worldview.
At this rate, I'm going to break my X button. Also, yes, I'm stopping this intro more than I really should, but it's to break up the music so I don't get a huge copyright claim on this because, hey, I need the ads. They pay for my claw sharpenings.
I think you'll agree with me that evolutionists use two terms that you've heard most often. One is called survival of the fittest, the other one natural selection.
I've heard mostly people who aren't well educated in the field of evolutionary biology use the term survival of the fittest, and just about everyone uses the term natural selection, including many creationists, most of whom fully accept natural selection as a mechanism of evolutionary change. They just pretend that it doesn't count as evolution because reasons. The phrase survival of the fittest is not a great one, but we'll be getting into that later, so I'll hold off on in-depth discussion of that for now.
Well, let's take a look at survival of the fittest. And I will say it this way, survival of the fittest, really? Does survival of the fittest actually prove evolution, or does survival of the fittest actually prove creation?
Neither. Science doesn't deal in proof, rather in confirmation, disconfirmation, and empirical evidence. Further, taking survival of the fittest to be a bad way to say natural selection, I don't think that one thing on its own can really help us differentiate between special creation or evolutionary theory as it is currently accepted. including universal common ancestry. Once we accept that organisms within a reproductive population are not all clones, and that some differences help some of them reproduce more than those organisms in the population that lack these differences, it's hard to get away from natural selection as a phenomenon, creationism or no. And again, that's not something most creationists would disagree with. In fact, the only major organization that I know of that's still trying to piss in the wind and overturn natural selection is the Institute for Creation Research, and not even the other creationists are very impressed with their efforts.
Think with me for a moment. There are not just one theory of evolution, there are many theories of evolution.
Odd, given this exchange.
So you said no evolutionary theory, as if there's more than one? How many evolutionary theories are there?
Quiet down for a minute.
How many evolutionary theories are there? Can you name two?
Did you ask me to name the number of evolutionary theories? Oh, yes.
Yeah, and you said they can't explain any scientific law. But we actually do have a number of scientific laws that specifically apply only to evolution.
You asked me how many, and I would tell you this. There are as many different theories of evolution as there are evolutionists.
It started with Darwinism and then became the Mendelo-Darwinian synthesis, and it's gone to another stage past that and is now the extended evolutionary hypothesis.
Well, you have the punctuated equilibrium folks too,
which is part of that modern extended synthesis. Yes,
it's a pretty
punctuated equilibrium is one of the laws that we can explain as part of the one and only theory of evolution.
If you want,
we do have explanations of the multiple laws.
That's your choice.
We do have multiple laws that apply only to the one and only theory of evolution. It's not that no evolutionary theory, because there's only one evolutionary theory. And you're saying they can't explain any scientific law, except that there's a number of scientific laws that only apply to evolutionary theory. So we can explain these things. And you haven't said anything. You have not said a single thing this evening that was correct.
As a matter of fact, if you had a million evolutionists together in one room, and, well, you'd have 1,000,001 theories of evolution present. They would all agree it's true, but no two would agree on exactly how it happened.
Near as I can tell, this is just a complaint that not literally everything about biology is known, so there are still open questions in the field. That's not really an indictment of the rest of the field, which is well known. Think about this in terms of meteorology. We don't know much about the exact way that tornadoes form or how lightning works, but that doesn't really stop us from being able to make a good prediction about the path of hurricanes, or whether it'll be hot tomorrow. Basically, Grady is saying that because we don't know every last thing about tornadoes and thunder, you should probably ignore those hurricane warnings. Pro tip, do not ignore hurricane warnings.
But let's think about what the various theories of evolution
can you name two?
Actually believe. What are they based upon? Well, the various theories of evolution say that the basic concepts of this evolution would be that particles would have to evolve into elements.
No, that's nucleosynthesis, and it is in fact well known how this happens. For hydrogen, it's pretty easy to figure out. Electrons and protons are attracted to each other by the electromagnetic force, so if you have some disassociated electrons and protons, they'll come together to form hydrogen, provided they're cool enough. Heavy elements, all the way to iron, form via nuclear fusion in stars, and the ones heavier than that form in supernovas. We can confirm this by actually observing the effects of radiation and looking at the chemical compositions of planetary nebulae, which are the nebulae left over by the explosion of a dying star.
That elements would have to form complex chemicals.
They do that on their own in nature all the time. There are clouds of alcohol in space, sugars are found on asteroids, and hydrocarbons form whole lakes on Titan. Granted, this isn't as complicated as the protein Titan, but then few things are.
That complex chemicals would have to form into simple living systems, although there is no such thing as a simple living system.
Anymore.
All living systems are complex. Even single-cell organisms are highly complex.
Today, after billions of years of competition and evolution, no modern life form is even remotely something you could call representative of the first living things. They would have been radically more simple than even the simplest modern organism. Further, much of the complexity in life is not really needed, and unnecessary complexity is a sign of bad design in design things. Maybe Grady is arguing that God sucks at engineering. That's not an argument to make, though, so perhaps Grady just hasn't thought this one through.
If Charles Darwin actually understood how complex a living system was, even at the single-cell level, he wouldn't have believed evolution himself.
Well, that's a statement with no evidence to support it, and no way to assess it. It's just, if this dead guy knew what I think I know, he would have believed differently. Well, if things were different, then they would be different.
And there is really no such thing as a simple living system. But if you do believe in evolution, you would have to believe that these simple living systems would have to form into complex life forms, and that complex life forms, well, would form animal life and eventually, supposedly, into man.
And bacteria, archaea, and the non-animal eukaryotes, including single-celled critters like amoebas, as well as fungi and plants. Everyone loves to just focus on animals, and I'll admit, I do too, but let's not pretend like evolution isn't working just as well on mushrooms as it is on doggos.
By some means of some innate property which must be within the material itself, because in evolution there can be no outside designer, creator, God. Everything must be by random chance and random chance alone.
I have no idea what he even means by innate property, but natural selection is not a chance-based thing. Some morphologies are bad at reproducing in given environments, and so they don't. Some are good at it, and so they do. In reality, it's not binary, but I'm simplifying a bit here. If the difference between binary and relative selection matters later, I'll go into it. But that some traits are deleterious and others beneficial is not a matter of chance. It's pretty deterministic. You'd think you could at least poke at the part of evolution that's mostly random, namely mutations.
Now, what are the assumptions of the various evolutionary theories?
Can you name two?
Well, the assumptions of various evolutionary theories would be that non-living chemicals gave rise to living material.
No, that's abiogenesis, and it's less of an assumption than it is a logical requirement of reality as we understand it. Given that material doesn't generally, as far as we know, simply pop into being out of nothing, and given that we have good reason to think that at one point life did not exist, it's hard to come to any conclusion other than, at some point, non-living material formed into living material. I guess the real assumption is that the first law of thermodynamics is true, and that the age of the Earth is the age of the Earth. So if you want to dispute that, you'll probably have to find a reason to argue with one of those. Now I know his solution will simply be that it was a miracle, so the laws of thermodynamics don't matter, and I guess in the situation of a miracle that may be true, but it also takes it out of the realm of science. Science can't really operate with supernatural causation as under consideration. Because science is the investigation specifically of the natural world, it requires things be testable and repeatable, and miracles, almost by definition, are neither.
That single-celled organisms gave rise to multiple-celled organisms. Then invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates. Even when I was an evolutionist, I had a huge problem with that one.
I'm actually really curious as to why.
How does a creature with a skeleton on the outside become a creature with a skeleton on the inside? I could never figure that out, and no transitional form has ever been found to support it.
What I believe is dumb.
Yep, that does seem far-fetched, and I agree that there are no transitional fossils of an animal going from having an exoskeleton to an endoskeleton. Of course, that's probably why that's not what any evolutionary biologists or paleontologists think happened. First, the world isn't divided into animals with exoskeletons and endoskeletons. Many animals have exoskeletons, like ants, shrimp, spiders, and even snails. Other animals have an endoskeleton, like humans, sea stars, sharks, and even sponges. Some animals have no skeleton, like jellyfish, flatworms, and roundworms, and even some crustaceans, like Dendrogaster. Some animals have both, like turtles. One group of animals that does not have an endoskeleton and has a bag of stiff proteins that could very loosely be called an exoskeleton is the tunicate. I bring up tunicates because, like vertebrates, they're chordates, and in fact, like chordates, they are olfactorates. Let's look at a larval tunicate, and also look at a larval lancelet, which again is an invertebrate chordate. So let's take a look at what they share. The big things I want to look at are the notochord and the segmented muscles. The notochord is where the central nervous system goes from the brain to the rest of the body, and it's the thing that the vertebrate spine protects. Here we have animals that are not vertebrates, do not have exoskeletons, and have the basic features of chordata. Now if we look at some of the earliest chordates in the fossil record, we have animals that are very similar to this, like Picaia. This animal is not known to be a vertebrate, and like lancelets and larval tunicates, it has segmented V-shaped muscles that help it swim, much like the muscles of a modern bony fish. And it has a notochord, like a vertebrate, but it also lacks any kind of cranium or spine. Then we have Hycoichthyes, which does have a cranial region, but still no spine. Next we come to numerous ostracoderms, which actually do have spines, but are still otherwise very similar to Hycoichthyes in overall morphology. The spine is not a matter of an exoskeleton becoming an endoskeleton. Instead, it's about first having cartilage around the brain and notochord to support stronger muscle attachment and protection. Then eventually some of the cartilage gets calcified, which is how bony skeletons develop both ontogenetically and evolutionarily. So our reason to dismiss the evolution of vertebrata is based on a straw man of evolution, whereas we do actually have transitional fossils between invertebrates and vertebrates, and it didn't require anyone to turn their skeleton inside out. But let's also remember that Grady McMurtry claims to have taught evolution in the past, and if this is his understanding of that subject, we have to wonder, was he just the worst teacher imaginable because he's immensely stupid? Or was he just a liar? Or is he just lying now? I honestly don't know, although if he grew up, as he said, on the UC Berkeley campus surrounded by evolutionary biologists, it seems hard to see how he could say something like this honestly.
And you have to have the idea that fish would give rise to amphibians, and amphibians would give rise to reptiles. Reptiles eventually give rise to birds, mammals, and of course, theoretically, eventually man.
It's a bit more complicated than that, since what we now think of as amphibians isn't what gave rise to birds and mammals, and fish doesn't really mean much in terms of biology, but that's not the worst summary.
And what two foundations do the various theories of evolution rest? Because evolution rests on two basic pillars, we might say.
Weird. Dan Biddle said it was 5 pillars.
The first pillar that supports the evolutionary theory would be time. The evolutionist lives and dies by 8 words. Those 8 words are, give me enough time and anything can happen.
No, not really. Some things can't happen at all, but on the other hand, some things that evidently have happened take a long time. Like it takes a while to build a whole mountain range, and another while to wear one down. But that's what happened with the Appalachian Mountains. On the other hand, it takes a while to get the evident biodiversity in the world, but the evidence for universal common ancestry of known life is overwhelming. So that evidently happened too. Add that together, and it seems like there has been a whole lot of time. Combine it with the fact that dating techniques tend to agree not only with each other, but also with estimates from things like sedimentology, geomorphology, and biology, and it all adds up to compelling evidence of the long age of the Earth.
Of course, the question must be, has there ever been enough time? And in other sessions, we showed there's never been enough time for evolution to be true. The Earth is in fact, the universe is in fact young.
Well, that's quite the claim, and to be fair, I haven't seen the other talks, so maybe he's got something compelling for us, but I'll be honest. I'm not really holding out hope for the guy who thinks that the way vertebrates would have had to evolve is by turning their skeletons inside out.
The other one is chance, that random chance can bring about complexity.
Well, it's not just chance, there are also vital non-chance aspects, like natural and sexual selection. I'll add that as a third pillar, selection.
Now, first of all, ask yourself a question. Evolution will talk about something called the Big Bang. When was the last time you saw an explosion construct a building?
Never. Fortunately, the Big Bang was not an explosion, neither did it directly build any buildings. That was an easy question.
And random chance will never produce complexity.
Well, that depends. If all you mean by complex is hard to exactly describe without lots of data, then actually randomness is about as complex as it gets. For example, make a 256 pixel by 256 pixel JPEG file that's just all black. It takes up 1.93 kilobytes. Now make one with completely random values for each pixel. When I did it, it took up 77.2 kilobytes. That's 40 times bigger. I'd argue that it's because the random noise is more complex, and so the algorithms used to compress JPEG images have to do more to accurately store the random noise. But further, even if we define complexity in a way that makes randomness alone incapable of producing complexity above a certain degree, evolution isn't just time and randomness. It's full of non-random aspects, as I've already stated.
Well, these are the two columns, the two pillars upon which evolutionary theories
Can you name 2?
stand. I'd also like you to think about this. Why is it impossible to offer scientific proof of origins? Remember that when we talk about creation versus evolution, we're talking about, did things evolve naturalistically or were they created supernaturally? And why is it impossible to give a direct scientific proof for creation or evolution?
Because science is about empirical evidence, not proof. At best, science can disprove things, never prove them. All scientific conclusions are held provisionally, and the provision being that new evidence doesn't come that disconfirms the idea. Once that happens, the idea is shown to be wrong and must be replaced, sometimes with a very similar idea, sometimes with a radically different one.
You see, it's impossible to prove them directly because the scientific method requires that we test in the present, get repeatable, verifiable results. What's the problem with creation or evolution? If you go back in time, you can't test it.
Well, that's dumb beyond belief. One of the basic assumptions of science is that nature acts essentially the same across time. If this is true, we can look at modern processes and see what effects they have, and then look for the same effects in the past. At that point, it's really good evidence that the processes tested in the present likely also caused the results in the past that they cause in the present.
If creation were true, it occurred in the past, and we can't go back and test it. We can't repeat it. We can't observe it.
That's true, but here's the thing. Past events leave present effects. Suppose you invite a guest over. You turn into bed before your guest and go to sleep. The next morning, you wake up to find your guest gone and a broken glass on the floor. Well, there are some possibilities. Maybe your guest was whisked off into the TV by poltergeists who also knocked one of your glasses onto the floor.
They're here.
Or maybe your friend did it. Well, if your friend did it, we could predict that their fingerprints might be found on the glass and the counter nearby. Let's assume that for the sake of argument, you have records of your friend's fingerprints and also no easy way to contact them now that they're out of the house. So you check for fingerprints, and lo and behold, the glass has fingerprints and so does the nearby counter, and they're your friends. Well, this is strong support of the "my friend dropped this glass" hypothesis, even though the event was in the past and there was no one around who witnessed it, besides your friend, but they're not available. Similarly, if universal common ancestry were a true claim about the past, we can make predictions about it, like genetic and morphological nested hierarchies, transitional fossils, etc. If creation were true, we can make other predictions about things, like a lack of an objective nested hierarchy, evidence of a global flood, if we're talking about biblical creationism, etc. The past is open to investigation. Saying otherwise is just science denialism.
Same thing is true of evolution. You can't go back in time, you can't observe it, you can't repeat it, you can't verify it. And you cannot prove creation or evolution from a direct testing standpoint.
Well, yeah, proof isn't for science, it's for alcohol and math. But we can absolutely figure out which of those fits the evidence.
A scientific investigator can neither observe nor repeat origins. And even if scientists could create life from non-life or higher kinds from lower kinds, it would not prove that such changes took place in the random past by natural process.
That's true, but then again it could demonstrate that the origin of life does not depend on supernatural intervention, and if the conditions in the laboratory sufficiently mimic those likely on early Earth, it could demonstrate that life could also have so arisen, even though nothing can prove for certain that it did.
Think with me for a moment.
Okay, let's put on our thinking caps.
Scientists are not prescriptive. Scientists are descriptive. The law of gravity does not work because Isaac Newton figured out a mathematical formula to show how it actually works, or its effect. The law of gravity existed before Isaac Newton came up with the formula.
No, gravity as a force existed before Newton. But the law of gravity is the equation, and Isaac Newton derived it to match his observations. The universe does what it does and seeks neither observation, approval, nor classification from humans. Humans, in an effort to put aspects of the universe in boxes, isolate particular interactions to the best of their ability, and then use measurements and math to come up with mathematical expressions to describe past interactions and predict future ones. This math, invented by humans, defines the laws. The laws of nature are a human invention, just like the words of a language. Nothing about nature compels humans to describe certain animals with the word dog, but humans did so. And the ones who speak English, at least, know what animal it refers to.
So scientists are not prescriptive. Nothing happens because a scientist says so. Scientists are descriptive. We describe what already exists.
I agree, except with Grady's use of the first-person plural personal pronoun. He's not part of the group of scientists. He's directly opposed to their work and is actively trying to stop them from doing it. He might as well show up to an Easter Mass dressed as Nero with a lion in tow saying how much he loves all the Christians.
Now, again, think with me for a moment. Scientists will never, ever create life in a test tube.
Citation needed.
And there's a very good reason for that. No scientist can speak and have something come into existence where there was nothing.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Now, we are approaching the point scientifically with nanotechnology and other things that we can actually manipulate individual atoms. We're at the point of perhaps making molecules and so forth. But think with me for a second. We're not creating anything. We are only manipulating what already exists.
Okay, but abiogenesis also isn't capable of creating life out of nothing. There's a reason it's abiogenesis and not vita ex nihilo. But abiogenesis is about the arrangement of pre-existing atoms and molecules, not their creation from thin air. If anything, that's far closer to what Grady believes.
Now, let's say that at some point in time, though I doubt that it will ever happen, but let's say at some point in time, scientists are clever enough to actually manipulate atoms and molecules and supposedly make a living cell. Now, the possibility of this is absolutely staggeringly, infinitely zero.
Hey, pro tip, if you're creating a hypothetical, it doesn't really matter how staggeringly unlikely the event in the hypothetical is. For the purposes of the hypothetical, it's a thing that is actually happening, for sure. So if you go on and on about meta-narrative points about how your hypothetical is, it just makes you look like a boring idiot.
However, let's just for a moment say it happened. So if scientists could not create, but could manipulate material and take non-living material and make it alive, what would it prove?
It would demonstrate that supernatural agency is not required in the formation of life. Depending on how it was done, it might even show that it could happen in prebiotically relevant circumstances, on Earth or elsewhere.
It would prove that it takes millions, billions of man and woman hours of intelligence, that you'd have to have almost unlimited resources to get life.
That's going to depend heavily on how that life was created, which he didn't go into. But even if it shows that life can be made with these unlimited resources that were not part of the hypothetical to begin with, it doesn't show that it's the only way. For instance, when I pointed out that it demonstrated that life can arise without supernatural interference, what I didn't say is that it demonstrated that life couldn't come about as a result of supernatural interference. Showing that I can bake a chicken doesn't mean I can't pan-fry a chicken. Being ignorant of the details of biology or evolutionary theory is one thing, but this is basic toddler-level logic. If Daddy can watch sports ball on the TV, it doesn't mean he can't do it on the computer or his phone.
And it would disprove evolution and prove creation.
Ah, yes. You see, the fact that scientists can't make life in a lab is evidence it takes God. But if scientists ever do make life in a lab, that just proves God did it. Heads, creationism wins, tails, science loses. That's not blatantly dishonest in any way.
And I want to introduce you to Hugo de Vries.
Hey, if you're going to pronounce his last name like you're going to pretend you know Dutch, then maybe don't say the name Hugo like you're speaking English, and if you can't say Hugo, then maybe don't bother trying and just say it like it's English the whole way through.
Now, Hugo was an evolutionist who wrote a book called Species and Varieties, Their Origin by Mutations, published in 1905. Now, he's an evolutionist. He wants to prove that mutations can produce evolution. And so he writes this book in 1905, and
then a century more of work was done, leaving me to puzzle as to why we're looking at this book for information about what modern evolutionary biology has to say about life.
What he actually proved was exactly the opposite. You see, he thought he had proven that macroevolution, that's the huge leaps that supposedly occur from one kind to get to a different kind, but macroevolution, these huge leaps that are supposed to occur at one time, produce the changes from one kind to another, that huge changes of macroevolution would cause apes to become people and so forth. But instead, he accidentally found genes, and that mutations always go downhill in nature.
He did rediscover the laws of Mendelian inheritance and coined the term pangenes, which was later shortened to just genes, and also introduced the term mutation for a change in a gene that arises in an organism but was not inherited from its parents. In fact, he even proposed chromosomal crossovers. He went to his grave continuing to accept that mutations gave rise to new variation which natural selection worked on to produce long-term changes in organisms. Now, he was also wrong about some important things. For instance, he was a saltationist, thinking that some mutations could cause drastic changes in the morphology of an organism, akin to a lizard hatching an egg that may contain a crocodile, rather than another lizard. This has been abandoned for good reason, and just like with Darwin, de Vries was a man who got some important things right, but also some things wrong, and is not the patron saint of mutations or something.
He actually disproved evolution, proved creation, proved that mutations are not beneficial, that they're actually destructive.
Where did he do that? Can I get a page number? Because I'm not going to read an entire, nearly 120-year-old work about genetics because the man who can't get basic logic right says it disproves that mutations can ever be beneficial, especially when I'm living in a world with lots of lactose-tolerant humans who are all benefiting from a famous beneficial mutation. Or in a world where a virus just recently had a mutation allowing it to infect humans and then became a pandemic that basically ruined 3 years of everybody's life. In other words, citation needed. Now, if you're watching this and you want to read all of de Vries' book, it's linked in the description. Have fun with it.
So let's talk about mutations for just a moment. Now, fruit flies are the favorite creature for mutation experiments because they're much smaller than we are, so they're easy to pick on. And they breed and multiply so fast you can do hundreds of generations of these in a relatively short time. So let's take a look at mutations. First of all, what are mutations? Many people don't understand what a mutation is.
A mutation is any change in a genome that occurs while the genome is being copied, whether that be during normal mitosis or in the process of meiosis.
But a mutation is a copying error.
Already jumping in with loaded language to prime the audience to think that mutation equals bad, since after all, how can an error be good?
A mutation is a structural change in the hereditary material which makes the offspring different from the parent.
Normally when we say structural in regards to a genome, we mean what goes where on what chromosome. And so a structural change would be something like a chromosome fission or fusion, or a gene hopping from one chromosome to another. And all of these are indeed mutations, but also something like a point mutation where one base pair is swapped for another would not be a structural change in any way, and it would still be a mutation.
Obviously, if there is no mutation, if you have exactly the same information, well, there's no change. And mutations are errors in copying the genetic codes. So with that idea in mind, that mutations are just copying errors, let's think about this. Why can't mutations produce evolutionary ascent?
Because evolutionary ascent is a made-up term that implies that evolution has some goal and that some forms are objectively more worthy than others. Science isn't here to tell you what's good or higher, that's for moral philosophy. For someone who claims to have taught science, it's kind of amazing how little Grady here knows about it.
First of all, the laws of genetics are conservative, they're not creative. Genetics never produces new information.
This whole section of the talk is about mutation, the thing that produces new information by basically any definition of information I've heard that actually allows one to quantify information in a genome. Ooh, but I'll bet that Grady won't bother to give such a definition, because if he does, it'll make his whole argument fall apart.
Genetics only conserves the previously existing information, passes it on into the next generation. So the laws of genetics are conservative, but they're not creative. Genetics never produces new beneficial information.
Weird then how simian immunodeficiency virus mutated its VPU protein coding gene to enable the protein to antagonize human tetherin, thereby enabling it to infect a new species, that is, Homo sapiens. That's a pretty big beneficial trait, since humans are far more numerous and widespread than the other apes it was infecting before the jump to humans. And remember, beneficial just means increasing the reproductive output of the organism in question. It doesn't mean you personally have to like it. I'm no fan of HIV, but that doesn't make it not the product of a beneficial mutation.
Genetics only copies or rearranges the previously existing information and passes it on into the next generation.
Unless there's a mutation, in which case something that wasn't in the previous generations arises and can be passed down. The only other option is to deny that mutations ever happen, but we can see them just by sequencing direct descendants in the modern day. Sequence the mitochondrial DNA of yourself, your mother, and her mother, and you'll see mutations at each step.
Now, when that happens, let's think about what happens in genetics. So in genetics, what happens? We copy the previously existing information. We copy mama, papa. We pass it on into the next generation in new combinations of information, but never new information.
Mutations.
Now, when you copy something, you have only two choices. When you copy something, you can either copy it perfectly, in which case there is no change, or what's the only other way that you can copy it?
Imperfectly.
Oh, imperfectly, is that right?
Yeah, although I prefer the term exactly and inexactly to describe copying since it's less emotionally charged.
Is it possible to copy something more perfectly? No, you can only either copy it perfectly or imperfectly, in which case mutations always lose or scramble up the previously existing information.
I try not to reuse memes too much, but...
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
If you open a document, change it, then save it to a new location, you now have two documents with different information. That's how this works. Mutations create new information the same basic way. The information is stored in a sequence of 4 different chemical tokens called nucleotides. If the sequence changes, then the information has changed, and thereby the information is now new information. And such a sequence change is exactly what a mutation is.
And genetics will never produce new information. So you can only copy perfectly or imperfectly, you cannot copy more perfectly.
See, this is why I prefer the terms exact and inexact. Perfect implies that any change is necessarily a downgrade, that at one point there existed perfect genetic codes, and that they are now wasting away under this mutation, but there's no evidence of this. Nor are there any data that would indicate that mutation on its own is causing populations of living organisms to inevitably get less fit. Using the term perfect here is just a way to emotionally manipulate the audience into seeing mutation as bad per se, and therefore reject it as the source of novel genetic traits that can be acted on by selection.
Mutations do not accumulate over time. They do not build up one upon another beneficially.
Interesting, because the aforementioned evolution of the VPU protein to antagonize H. sapiens tetherin in SIV to create HIV required about 4 to 7 mutations to accumulate before it gained a new function. But hey, don't believe me? Check Sauter et al. 2012, Vegan and Neal 2010, and Lim et al. 2010, who all record multiple mutations in the different regions of the VPU coding gene. So, you know. Or to be fair, maybe McMurtry is lying about growing up learning biology from top minds and then teaching it. Either way though, if there were justice in the universe, his nose would be long enough to disrupt the moon's orbit.
Charles Darwin actually struggled with this, even though he didn't know anything about genetics.
Charles Darwin struggled with mutations the same way that Hammurabi struggled with tensor calculus, in that neither did, because you can't struggle with things you've never heard of, nor been able to discover. Darwin struggled with the origin of new variation, and Hammurabi with gravity pulling things down, but that's not the same thing.
But in his evolutionary theories, he was saying the human eye was one of the most wonderful, marvelous mechanisms in the universe. And I'm paraphrasing him, but he said basically this: It would take 1 million additive beneficial mutations to go from a cell that had the sensitivity to light to getting to a functioning, working human eye.
You know what? Let's see what he said, because screw it. I'm tired of people lying about Darwin despite the fact that literally nothing he said would make any difference to modern evolutionary biology, because nothing in it depends on his thought in any way. This section is from Chapter 7 of the 6th edition of The Origin of Species by Darwin, and is called Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication. To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for emitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. When it was first said that the sun stood still and the world turned round, the common sense of mankind declared this doctrine false. But the old saying of vox populi, vox Dei, as every philosopher knows, cannot be trusted in science. Reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certainly the case, if further the eye ever varies and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if such variations could be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, should not be considered as subversive of the theory. How a nerve becomes sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself originated. But I may remark that some of the lowest organisms in which nerves cannot be detected are capable of perceiving light. It does not seem impossible that certain sensitive elements in their sarcode could become aggregated and develop into nerves, endowed with this special sensibility. In searching for the gradations through which an organ in any species can be perfected, we ought to look exclusively to its lineal progenitors. But this is scarcely ever possible, and we are forced to look to other species and genera of the same group, that is, to the collateral descendants from the same parent form, in order to see what gradations are possible, and for the chance of some gradations having been transmitted in an unaltered or little altered condition. But the state of the same organ in distinct classes may incidentally throw light onto the steps by which it has been perfected. The simplest organ that can be called an eye consists of an optic nerve surrounded by pigment cells and covered by translucent skin, but without any lens or other refractive body. We may, however, according to M. Jourdain, descend even a step lower and find aggregates of pigment cells, apparently serving as organs of vision, without any nerves and resting merely on sarcodic tissue. Eyes of the above simple nature are not capable of distinct vision and serve only to distinguish light from darkness. In certain starfishes, small depressions in the layer of pigment which surrounds the nerves are filled, as described by the author just quoted, with transparent gelatinous matter projecting from a convex surface, like the cornea in higher animals. He suggests that this serves not to form an image, but only to concentrate the luminous rays and render their perception more easy. In this condition of the rays, we gain the first and by far the most important step towards the formation of a true picture-forming eye. For we have only to place this naked extremity of the optic nerve, which in some of the lower animals lies deeply buried in the body, and in some near the surface, at the right distance from the concentrating apparatus, and an image will be formed on it. In the great class of articulata, we may start from an optic nerve simply coated in pigment, the latter sometimes forming a sort of pupil, but destitute of lens or other optical contrivance. With insects, it is now known that numerous facets of the cornea of their great compound eyes form true lenses, and that the cones include curiously modified nerve filaments. But these organs in articulata are so much more diversified that Muller formally made these three main classes with 7 subdivisions, besides a 4th main class of aggregated simple eyes. When we reflect on these facts, here given much too briefly, with respect to the wide, diversified, and graduated range of the structure of eyes in the lower animals, and when we bear in mind how small the number of all living things must be in comparison with those that have become extinct, the difficulty ceases to be very great in believing that the natural world may have converted the simple apparatus of an optic nerve, coated with pigment and invested by a transparent membrane, into an optical instrument as perfect as is possessed by any member of the articulata class. He who will go thus far ought not to hesitate to go one step further if he finds on finishing this volume that large bodies of facts otherwise inexplicable can be explained by the theory of modification through natural selection. He ought to admit that a structure even as perfect as an eagle's eye might thus be formed, although in this case he does not know the transitional states. It has been objected that in order to modify the eye and still preserve it as a perfect instrument, many changes would have had to be effected simultaneously, which, it is assured, cannot be done through natural selection. But as I have attempted to show in my work on the variation of domestic animals, it is not necessary to suppose that the modifications were all simultaneous, if they were extremely slight and gradual. Different kinds of modification would also serve for the same general purpose, as Mr. Wallace has remarked. If a lens has too short or too long a focus, it may be amended either by alteration of curvature or an alteration of density. If the curvature be irregular and the rays do not converge at a point, then any increased regularity of curvature will be an improvement. So the contraction of the iris and muscular movements of the eye are neither of them essential to vision, but only improvements which might have been added and perfected at any stage of the construction of the instrument. Within the highest divisions of the animal kingdom, namely vertebrata, we can start from an eye so simple that it consists, as in the lancelet, of a sac of transparent skin furnished with a nerve and lined with pigment, but destitute of any other apparatus. In fishes and reptiles, as Owen has remarked, the range of gradation of dioptric structures is very great. It is a significant fact that even in man, according to the high authority of Virchow, the beautiful crystalline lens is formed in embryo by the accumulation of epidermic cells lying in a sac-like fold of the skin, and the vitreous body is formed from the embryonic subcutaneous tissue. To arrive, however, at just a conclusion regarding the formation of the eye with all its marvelous yet not absolutely perfect characters, it is indispensable that the reason should conquer the imagination. But I have felt the difficulty far too keenly to be surprised at others hesitating to extend the principle of natural selection to so startling a length. It is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the eye with a telescope. We know that this instrument has been perfected by the long-continued efforts of the highest human intellects, and we naturally infer that the eye has been formed by a somewhat analogous process. But may not this inference be presumptuous? Have we any right to assume that the Creator works by intellectual powers like those of man? If we must compare the eye to an optical instrument, we ought in imagination to take a thick layer of transparent tissue, with spaces filled with fluid, and with a nerve sensitive to light beneath, and then suppose every part of this layer to be continually changing slowly in density, so as to separate into layers of different densities and thicknesses, placed at different distances from each other, and with the surfaces of each layer slowly changing in form. Further, we must suppose that there is a power presented by natural selection or the survival of the fittest, always intently watching slight alteration in the transparent layers, and carefully preserving each, which under varied circumstances in any way or degree, tends to produce a distincter image. We will suppose each new state of the instrument to be multiplied by the million, each to be preserved until a better is produced, and the old ones to be all destroyed. In living bodies, variation will cause the slight alteration, generation will multiply them almost infinitely, and natural selection will pick out with unerring skill each improvement. Let this process go on for millions of years, and during each year on millions of individuals of many kinds, and may we not believe that a living optical instrument might thus be formed as superior to one of glass, as the works of the Creator are to those of man? So did Darwin despair of the evolution of the eye or other complex organs? No, he did not. In fact, he only brought it up to preempt the criticism and show why it would not work.
And he himself argued, and he said, what benefit would there be to have a creature that had 512,372 additive beneficial mutations, but was still only halfway to a working eye?
Where did he say that? I can't find anywhere he estimated the number of beneficial mutations it would need. Which makes sense because the concept of mutations wouldn't be invented until after his death, and that number appears nowhere in The Origin of Species, which is where the whole eye discussion appears.
Because after all, what benefit is it to a creature to have a partially formed organ or structure?
Well, let's go through it in a couple of such structures. Eyes and wings. So a simple patch of photosensitive cells can provide day-night information to an animal, which will allow it to coordinate its active and inactive times to best acquire food and avoid predation. Flatworms do pretty well with this sort of arrangement. Putting those cells in a depression will give a bit of directional information and so allow the animal to know if something has passed overhead, which might be a predator. This allows it to scurry away from such shadow-casting objects, which will likely increase survival. Narrowing the hole will increase resolution to the point of eventually even allowing a resolvable image to form. Every step of the way allows for more accurate evasion of predators or acquisition of food, and eventually you get a pinhole camera eye, like a nautilus has. Now, organisms make clear stuff all the time, and if some of it sits over the pinhole, it can gather and focus more light, allowing for even better image quality. This is basically what happens with the simple eyes, or ocelli, of spiders. Fill that with some goopy clear stuff for further stability with optical clearness, and you have a human or a squid eye. Every step along the way is better vision than the step before, and each step is functional. Let's try for wings. Wings start out as arms or legs, so they're being used for locomotion and or manipulating objects like food. Bird wings started as arms, bat wings are probably legs, and pterosaur wings are harder to say, but still probably arms. Now, in the earlier stages, we get things like velociraptor or a flying squirrel. The wings are still useful for what they did before, that is locomotion or manipulation, but they have some added aerodynamic capabilities. This might let the animal control a fall, keep its balance, or even in the case of some dinosaurs, assist in climbing into trees. In the case of birds, it's using the feathers that were already there for display anthroporegulation of both self and eggs for aerodynamic purposes. With bats and pterosaurs, it's a fairly simple matter of not killing off as much of the tissue between digits and limbs as normally happens in embryonic development, leaving behind fleshy webbing. There are many animals today with partial wings, like sugar gliders, draco lizards, flying frogs, flying squirrels, flying lemurs or colugos, flying fish, etc. Going from there to flight is just a matter of being able to add energy to the glide faster than gravity converts the potential energy into kinetic energy. So what good is a partial wing? Well, it's an adequate arm or leg, and it helps when falling or climbing or balancing.
But Charles Darwin's false conclusion was this. He said, but it must have happened because we have eyes.
No, in fact, he gave a detailed explanation of why it's not a problem in the first place. Like, I already read it. We all know this is just a lie. Why do creationists just keep telling easily falsifiable lies, and about people who don't really matter to the discussion? If you're a creationist, I want you to tell me in the comments why it is that virtually every one of these talks I listen to, something blatantly and demonstrably untrue is said by someone who either knows better or is lying by portraying themselves as someone who does.
Well, that's a great faith statement, but it's not science.
I mean, I guess he could consider it a great faith statement, since his entire MO is assuming that he's right at the outset and then taking everything as evidence of that. But here we can see projection, because of course Darwin said nothing like that.
Mutations do not create new organs, they only modify existing organs or structures.
That's true.
But that's all it takes. Lungs didn't start out as a brand new organ, they started out as an outgrowth of the digestive tract. Eyes didn't start out as new organs, they started out as part of the skin, but with slightly higher concentrations of light-sensitive opsin proteins. Wings didn't start out as new organs, they started out as arms or legs, in tetrapods at least. It's like a color gradient. If I show you red and yellow, they're pretty darn distinct. But if I show you a color gradient going between them, there's no objective place to point out where it goes from red to yellow. It's just an orangey mess. Similarly, if you start out with a basal vertebrate without lungs, and then you go to one with a bit of extra sac of stomach tissue that's absorbing extra oxygen, to a full-blown lungfish, to a tetrapod, if you could watch the digestive system at every stage, there'd be no single point where the pulmonary and digestive systems split into distinct things. This also works for languages. Here are some examples of English. He queth. So thlicha summan hef de tweeën suna, da queth se yingre to his vader. Vader sede mi mine del mine echte, de me toi gebireth. Da del de he him his echte. Da afterfeum dion, el his thinge jegaderode se yingre sunu on ferlen, riche on forspilde there his echte, libende on his gelsen. That's from about 1,000 years ago. Let's go forward 400 years. For sothe. He saith summan hadde tweeën sones, and the younger said to his father, Father, give me min portion of substance that befalleth to me. And the father departed to him the substance. And not after many days, alle things yedired to yedire, the younger son went in pilgrimage into a fair country, and there he wasted his substance in living lecherously. Now another 200 years or so. And he said a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of good that hath befalleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. Finally, another 300 years. He said there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided this property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. As you might all be able to tell, that was Luke 15:11-13, the start of the parable of the prodigal son. I chose that text because its popularity means that versions from many different times are available, and so it's an easy text to give examples of in English from different time periods. Now, most of you probably have grandparents who speak the same language you do, or at least have met people of an age that would make it reasonable for the people in question to be your grandparents. You can understand each other just fine. Sure, they might not have all the same colloquialisms you do, and they might be a bit old-fashioned, but you don't really have problems communicating, and no one would likely say that if you and they both speak English, that you're speaking different languages. Probably not even with different dialects in most cases. And just like with biological evolution, from one generation to the next, you'll only typically see very minor changes. But over enough generations, just like with English, you can get organisms that are extremely different. As different as so thlicha subman hef de tweeën suna, and there was a man who had 2 sons, or even more different. Because let's not forget that English itself is a Germanic language, and so shares a common ancestor with German, where the phrase is even more different. I'm not going to make you suffer through my attempts to pronounce German, but it's on screen. But hey, the Germanic languages share a common ancestry with the Romance languages, and the phrase in French comes out as un homme avait 2 fils. But wait a minute. Hindi is also an Indo-European language, where the phrase is this on screen, which, since most people in my audience probably can't read, it comes out as something close to ek vyakti ke dobetete. My sincerest apologies to all the Hindi speakers there for my unceremonious slaughter of their language. Similarly, when populations speciate, each species can go in a different direction such that after a while they no longer seem very similar. The process in biological evolution and human languages are very similar.
Mutations lose information, not gain it. Mutations lead to the wrong kind of change. Now, every one of you knows that what I'm saying is absolutely true.
No.
No, it's demonstrably, obviously, and laughably wrong.
Let me give you a simple little example. What if I were to go down into the audience, and let's just say I go over here on that end. We know that gentleman right over there, well, he's a stalwart, upright member of the community, never told a lie in your entire life, correct, sir? Seems like this is a little sort of a hard sell right here, sir. Don't say anything. Now, if I were to tell him for 5 minutes a story which nobody else in the room could hear, and then I asked him to repeat that story exactly, verbatim, exactly word for word as I told it to him, to her, and then her to her, and then her to him, and him to her, and I go all the way across here, and finally I get over on that end, and I ask her to tell me the story that I told him. How many of you will agree you won't even recognize the country it occurred in? Hello?
Hello. Yes, the telephone game is a widely understood thing. In fact, it's actually pretty similar to evolution in some ways. The story will change with every telling because of the imperfection of human memory, but the human understanding of logic and narrative structure tends to ensure that the story stays more or less coherent at each stage, and by the end what comes out is still a comprehensible story, even though it will bear very little similarity to the initial story.
What happened to the story? Mutations. Copying errors, is that correct?
Yes, more or less.
Or, well, let's think more about mutations as well. Why can't mutations produce evolutionary ascent? Well, the laws of genetics prevent new beneficial information at a higher level of intelligence or complexity from occurring by random chance.
How so? This would require some mutations to simply be blocked from occurring in such a way that all such blocked mutations would be beneficial. But let's take a look at that. Let's say that there's a protein that helps humans digest their food. We'll pick amylase, as humans produce a lot of it, and have multiple copies of the amylase gene which express in different parts of the digestive tract. It's what makes humans so good at breaking down starchy foods like maize, wheat, and potatoes. So let's say that there's a point mutation that breaks the copy of the amylase gene that expresses in the salivary glands. Now, this human can't get as much nutrition out of food like bread, beer, popcorn, potatoes, taquitos, etc. Now let's just say that the mutation was changing a guanine and changing it to a cytosine. Okay, so this seems on the whole like this mutation is probably deleterious, at least in a situation where calories are not abundant. So we'll say that this person is living in a subsistence farming society. Well, now this person and their children who inherit this trait have to spend more time gathering food and eating and less time mating and caring for children. So this family will likely have measurably lower reproductive capacity than those around them. Now here's the question. What prevents cytosine from turning into a guanine again? This would clearly be a beneficial mutation, as it would immediately transform an amylase pseudogene into a functioning amylase gene. That's obviously beneficial. But if there's a law of genetics that prevents beneficial mutations, apparently this back mutation is physically impossible. Further, this doesn't work because mutations aren't objectively beneficial or detrimental. It's dependent on environment. We can look to mice for an example of this. In most environments, mice tend to be dark-colored, because that makes it easier to blend in. The agouti gene can result in sandy or straw-colored mice, but also it can result in dead mice where the light color is homozygous. Further, the light color is dominant. So in most populations, the light color allele is vanishingly rare, and when it pops up, it is not infrequently a new mutation. But what happens when mice live on and around the beaches of Florida, which have very light-colored sand? Well, now that mutation that was harmful in most places is helpful. So do the laws of genetics prevent a mutation to the agouti gene in beach mice, but not in forest mice? Because in one case it's beneficial, but in the other it's detrimental? That sure doesn't sound like a natural law to me. What mechanism could possibly look at the environment, decide that certain mutations would be helpful in that environment, and then block them, then in different environments, block other mutations and allow what was previously blocked? You see, none of this makes sense when you think about it, even for a little bit.
Think with me for a minute. We copy the previously existing information. You can either copy it perfectly or imperfectly, but not more perfectly. So there is no opportunity to add new beneficial information.
Okay, but we're talking here about the telephone game. And what would make information good or bad? I'd say perhaps whether it makes the story more or less interesting, but that's subjective. But interestingly, we do have a form of natural selection for stories. You see, folk stories are traditional stories that are rarely written down and instead tend to be told person to person over generations. Those stories do indeed change over time, and less popular versions are shared less often and so go extinct, whereas more interesting versions can take over. So if you remove the artificial constraints in a telephone game of only single person-to-person transmission, low numbers of people transmitting the story, and the ability of people to choose which version to pass on, then you sure can add beneficial information. By the way, this concept is essentially the concept of a meme, first developed by Richard Dawkins, in which ideas undergo a process of spread, change, and selection, similar to what organisms go through.
Evolutionists will counter with this argument. They will say, well, you see, that's true, but...
No, they won't. They'll laugh in your face because it's incredibly stupid. Or if they're feeling nicer, they might decide to treat you more like a toddler, because clearly you're struggling to get much more cognitive ability than that. But oh well, let's hear the rest of the straw man.
While on Earth things are decaying, but you see, the sun, it's the sun. The sun's producing all this light and energy going everywhere and so forth, and the Earth just happens to capture a little bit of that energy. And because of capturing that little bit of random energy coming from the sun, it reverses the second law of thermodynamics on Earth and allows things to actually progress instead of go downhill.
I'm sorry, the thing that prevents beneficial mutations from happening is the second law of thermodynamics? You know, that thing that isn't about genetics at all? Well, I guess it's time to talk about the second law out of the blue. So the second law of thermodynamics says that in an isolated system, the amount of energy available to do mechanical work cannot increase over time. It can be held steady, or it can decrease. This is why your car runs out of fuel, why you need to keep eating to not starve, and why batteries run out of charge eventually, even if you don't use them. Now we need to define some terms. Systems in thermodynamics can be open, closed, or isolated. But what's a system? Well, it's whatever we want it to be. You can say that a single organism is a system, a whole planet, the universe as a whole, etc. Basically, it's whatever we're trying to analyze thermodynamically. An open system is one in which matter and energy can be exchanged with the environment. An organism is a great example of an open system. For example, a tree takes in carbon dioxide, minerals, and sunlight in order to grow. A closed system is one in which matter is not exchanged with the environment, but energy is. A computer would generally be a decent example of this. Energy comes in from the outside, but in normal operation, no matter is really added to the computer, and only the energy is used to perform functions. An isolated system is one where neither matter nor energy is exchanged with the surrounding environment. An example might be a closed-cycle steam engine, where a fuel is burned to boil water, which then condenses to be fed back into the boiler. If we don't refuel the system, it is essentially isolated. Now, generally speaking, systems are not strictly open, isolated, or closed. For example, the steam engine is going to shed heat to the environment, but for most purposes, we can treat it as isolated, provided that it's reasonably well insulated from such external heat exchange. So it's important that strictly the second law only applies to isolated systems. This is because mechanical work requires an energy gradient. It requires more energy in one place than in another. You can think of this like a river. Water won't flow if there's no gradient in the terrain. That is, no slope. It's just a pool and it won't go anywhere. Therefore, it's not doing any work. It's not moving sediment, for example. But the steeper the slope or gradient, the more work can be done by the water. In a thermodynamic situation, this is often accomplished by heat. With a hot part of the system and a cold part, you can derive reactions like the steam engine described earlier. But when you use this gradient to perform work, you have to take energy from the point in the system with high energy and bring it to the point in the system with low energy. This lowers the difference between them, meaning that only so much work can be done without adding new energy, either in the form of direct energy input, such as heating the hot point with an external heat source, or by adding matter in the form of some kind of fuel. Note, this does not just apply to heat engines. A gravity engine works thermodynamically in the same way. For example, if you had a large stack of heavy objects, which are lowered by a pulley system to produce work elsewhere, you can only produce as much work as allowed by the potential energy stored in your tower of heavy things. The quantity of energy in a system unavailable to do work is measured by a quantity called entropy. One of the things I want to drive home is how little this has to do with any concept of order, complexity, chaos, or decay. A living human has far more entropy than a frozen dead mouse. But I don't think people would consider the dead mouse a preferable thing to be for this reason, or to be more valuable, or in most other ways better than a living human. How does any of this prevent a mutation from helping an organism reproduce more than its peers? I have no clue. It really doesn't, and even some of the better informed creationists know this. Indeed, Lord Kelvin, who was no fan of evolution and who invented the second law of thermodynamics, did not criticize evolution on this ground.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll excuse me for just a moment. If I, as a teacher in a classroom,
A deeply disturbing thought.
believed that the input of excess undirected energy would accomplish anything,
What does it mean for energy to be undirected? The only thing I can think of is that it's being input into a system in a way that does not allow the system to do more work. For example, if you had a heat engine and added external heat in such a way that you added thermal energy to both the heat source and the heat sink, but kept the gradient between them intact, then you likely would not have allowed the system to do more or less work. So I guess if you directed the heat to the heat source, that would increase the capacity of the system to do work, but equally, you could direct it at only the heat sink. decreasing the ability of the system to do work. But also, depending on the physical qualities of a system, simply shoving energy at it could result in the energy adding to the gradient. Basically, to say that undirected energy cannot increase the ability of a system to do work, you'd have to show why that energy cannot go to increasing the energy gradient of the system under any circumstances. Who wants to bet that McMurtry here does no such thing?
I would have all my students stand up, take 2 fingers, lick them, go over to that wall socket, and stick them in. I will now have added excess undirected energy to their system. But tell me something, will it be better for the experience?
No, it won't. Congrats on finding an example of adding energy into a system in a way that does not increase its ability to do work. That was always a possibility. What we need to show to make this argument work, though, is not that it is possible to add energy to a system in a way that will increase its ability to do work, but that it is impossible to add energy to a system in a way that will. Good luck with that.
Oh, come on. Assuming they survive, they're only going to get 2 things out of this little experiment. The first is, don't ever do that again. And the second thing is, their nervous system will never be quite the same again.
Yes, it probably will. It's entirely possible to survive a shock from a normal wall socket, which in the USA carries 120 volts AC RMS at 60 Hz. I know, because it happened to me, and I have no neurological symptoms because of it. That's not to say you should think it's safe. Even a mild shock has the potential to be fatal, and should be avoided with the exception of medical devices for muscle stimulation, which are extremely carefully designed to avoid danger, but even then, if you put the lead across someone's heart, for example, that could still kill them. Unless you're trained, you should not be using such devices on people.
But think with me. Adding excess undirected energy to a system will destroy the system.
Depends on what undirected means, and how much and of what kind of energy and how fast it is added to the system, and also on what it means to be destroyed. If I boil an egg from the standpoint of a chicken, I might have destroyed it, but from the standpoint of me who wants to eat a boiled egg, that's an improvement.
For example, in my presentations, I use laptop computers, I use video projectors, but they're made to be used anywhere in the world. I can plug them into a 110, a 220, a 50 cycle, a 60 cycle, it makes no difference. I can use it in Japan, Russia, South Africa, I do it all the time. But I have a desktop computer at home. In the United States, we use 110, 60 cycle currents, and
voltage in US wall outlets started at 110 in the 1930s, but by the 1980s, 120 was the standard, and most devices can tolerate a range of voltages that encompasses both values.
Well, if I were to pack up my computer at home on the desktop, take it with me to Russia, and I do this twice a year, I go to Russia, so if I take it to Russia, and I unpack it, and I stick it in the wall, and I turn it on, in about 1/4 of 1 second, I'll have a piece of fried junk.
No, you won't, because you won't be able to. US plugs don't fit in Russian wall outlet sockets. Russia uses 220 volts 50 Hz power, so if you had a straight adapter that simply replaced the rectangular cross-section leads on the American device with the circular leads of a Russian device, that would indeed cause some problems.
Because in Russia they use 220. Well, what happened? My computer was destroyed because I added excess undirected energy.
No, actually, assuming the use of a basic adapter to get power into the machine, the energy was no more or less directed than before. So a computer power supply is basically a big rectifier, because computers, being electronic devices, need direct current, whereas wall sockets provide alternating current power. A rectifier is a circuit that uses diodes, which also allow current to flow in one direction with extremely low resistance, but have extremely high resistance in the other direction, essentially blocking current flow in that direction. Diodes are like the check valves of electronics. Rectifiers can be as simple as just putting a single diode in series with the circuit, which reduces the full sine wave of an alternating voltage to just 1/2 of the sine wave. They can be more complex bridge rectifiers, which flip 1/2 of the voltage sine wave in a direction and keep the other half. Or they can be even more complicated ones that store some of the energy to give a lower voltage but more constant direct current output. A rectifier directs energy, but it can only handle so much before things start happening, like frying insulation, burning out contacts, or overwhelming the reverse direction resistance of diodes. But the amount of energy direction remains the same until system failure. It's the rate of energy input that's causing a problem here.
But you will never get an increase in complexity or intelligence without the input from a greater intelligence.
I would like to counter with tornadoes, which are highly complex weather phenomena that can do immense amounts of work, and which are, as far as we can tell, not intelligently designed. In fact, tornadoes actually have a few things in common with life. For one thing, they are self-organizing. Tornadoes form from pressure fronts and clouds, and complex organisms grow from a single cell. And both organize themselves as they develop. Both take advantage of energy gradients, whether it be thermal or chemical, and reduce those gradients faster than if they did not exist. In fact, both life and tornadoes are systems that increase entropy by feeding on energy gradients in ways that are perfectly in line with the laws of thermodynamics. and the fact that if you take either in isolation, they do not follow the second law of thermodynamics, because both do not have to increase in entropy over time, because both have inputs of energy that they are taking advantage of. And both end up dying out when that source of energy goes away or the structure that allowed them to take advantage of that energy source is sufficiently disrupted.
And simply adding undirected excess energy to a system will destroy the system. It will not benefit the system.
Again, that depends on a lot. It's not simply a rule that holds true in all cases. In fact, given that directed and undirected haven't even been defined in this context, it's not even a thought. It's just a collection of words intended to trick the audience.
So the addition of excess undirected energy will accomplish nothing beneficial. It will just destroy the previously existing system. You will never get a beneficial increase in intelligence or complexity without the input from a greater intelligence.
A point that hasn't even been argued for. Let's bring this back to genetics for a bit. For this to work as a genetic barrier to beneficial mutations, McMurtry would have to show that some mutations are thermodynamically dependent and that others are not, and that which ones are and are not changes with environment in such a way that beneficial mutations always require a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. Now, DNA replication is accomplished with the use of chemical energy, as are virtually all cellular processes. The breakup of adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate releases energy which drives DNA replication. This is also the energy that is used up when a mutation occurs, which in many cases doesn't actually take more energy than the mutation not occurring. So for this to make sense, some mutations would have to do something like cause the amount of available chemical energy in the cell to go up without taking any new matter or energy into the cell. And which ones do would have to depend on which mutations would be beneficial in the environment. But mutations don't just add energy to the cell, they reduce it. In that, DNA replication as a whole uses energy. Further, what mechanism could possibly predict whether a mutation will be beneficial, such that it would change the energy balance of the DNA replication? See, none of this makes even the first bit of sense. It relies on this idea that entropy means chaos, when it just doesn't, along with a fundamental lack of understanding of the fitness value of mutations being conditional and varying rather than fixed and non-conditional.
Again, why can't mutations produce evolutionary ascent? Well, mutations affect and are affected by many genes and other intergenic information acting in combination with one another. It is absolutely simplistic and false to believe that a gene controls a function. That's not true. Genes work in combination, along with pseudogenes, retroviruses, all kinds of things.
That's true.
This is true. Very few genes affect only one thing. That's why the light fur version of the agouti gene in mice can result in non-viable mice when it's homozygous. Because clearly it's affecting more than just how much melanin is in the fur, which on its own would not be fatal. Which we can see because albino mice exist and can grow to reproductive age and reproduce, all without any melanin. But the thing is that the fitness of an organism is basically the sum of the fitness effects of all their genes, then affected by what randomness exists in the environment. But in large enough populations, that randomness tends to even out, and what's left tends to be a largely natural selection based on the summed fitness effects. So if a mutation makes an animal better at getting food but also easier for predators to catch, whether it's beneficial depends on whether the greater reward outweighs the greater risk. If it does, then it's beneficial and will spread. If it doesn't, it's detrimental and it won't. The fact that genes interact and affect more than one trait isn't news to evolutionary biologists.
The addition of the accidental duplication of previously existing information is detrimental.
Well, that's certainly a take. Allow me to introduce you to the notothenioi icefish from Antarctica. You see, this lineage of fish has an antifreeze glycoprotein that allows them to live in waters that are so cold that most other fish would have the water in their cells start to freeze, turning into jagged ice crystals with more volume than the water they formed from. You probably don't need it explained to you why jagged crystals rupturing your cells is bad for you. So how did these fish get such a handy protein? Well, they had a duplication of part of their trypsinogen gene, which after duplication then went on to further mutate to become an antifreeze protein. So while duplication on its own isn't going to help much, it can make duplicate or partial duplicate genes that can then go on to acquire new functions while leaving the original gene intact. This seems like it would be adding information under any definition that matters.
I'll prove that a little later.
Sure you will, buddy.
But think with me. The accidental duplication of previously existing information being added into a system is detrimental to the system.
Yeah, it's not like you might want more than one amylase gene so that multiple tissue types can express it and thereby significantly increase the caloric value of starchy foods. Oh wait, that's exactly what humans do. Darn. Interestingly enough, it's also what domesticated and feral dogs do, but not wolves. And creationists acknowledge that dogs are derived from wolves, which means that even in creation land, this is an example of gene duplication occurring and being beneficial, and of course it's beneficial because dogs eat a diet much more like the diet of humans than wolves, and therefore it's much heavier in starch than a wolf diet. So they developed salivary amylase, just like humans, but had to do it based on a wolf genome that had no such gene, and their salivary amylase gene is just a duplicate of one of their other amylase genes that they have. Evolution sure is neat, and easily demonstrable, isn't it?
Mutations are random, they are not directed, they are not beneficial.
I wonder if he'll ever actually try to justify that statement in a way that doesn't violate the basic laws of logic and rises to the actual level of coherent thought. That would be a nice improvement.
And why can't mutations produce evolutionary descent? Well, random mutations produce microevolution. Now, microevolution is the little tiny changes. They're simply shifts in a gene pool, right or left. Microevolution is the reason that no two of us look exactly alike. But microevolution is not macroevolution. Micro, just variation within a kind. Macro, supposedly the jump from one kind to another kind.
Okay, everybody say it with me now. What's a kind? And yeah, it's a really important question, because evolution isn't about saltatory leaps, where radically new organisms form. I know you've probably heard me go through this before, so I'll take a different path than going through the human lineages. Let's go with frogs. Well, the first uniconts that evolved were still eukaryotes. When the first opisthocons evolved, they were still uniconts. When the first metazoans evolved, they were still uniconts. When the first eumetazoans evolved, they were still metazoans. When the first bilaterians evolved, they were still bilaterians. When the first deuterostomes evolved, they were still bilaterians. When the first chordates evolved, they were still deuterostomes. When the first vertebrates evolved, they were still chordates. When the first osteichthyans evolved, they were still vertebrates. When the first sarcopterygians evolved, they were still osteichthyans. When the first stegocephalians evolved, they were still sarcopterygians. When the first tetrapods evolved, they were still stegocephalians. When the first lissamphibians evolved, they were still tetrapods. When the first anurans evolved, they were still lissamphibians. At no point is an organism's ancestry just left behind so it can jump into some new group that isn't part of the same clade as it was in previously. So what options do we have for defining clades? Well, we could define it based on morphology, but there's no obvious barrier that prevents morphology from changing beyond a certain degree. In fact, one of creation's favorite groups of animals, the domesticated dog, shows that pretty darn conclusively, with the wild array of morphology that they've managed to have in just the last few centuries of breeding. This probably won't work since there's no definite amount of morphological change that creationists could point to. More intellectually consistent definition might be that a kind is a group of organisms that do not share universal common ancestry with any other group of organisms. Of course, the problem here is just that universal common ancestry just becomes the claim that there is only one kind, and then suddenly evolution doesn't involve the evolution of new kinds or changes in kind. So yeah, if creationists want to use a change in kinds being impossible as an objection to evolution, they have a lot of work to do to actually make it a real thought, never mind a problem scientists should grapple with.
But microevolution is just variation within a kind.
Actually, it's evolution below the species level. Once speciation has occurred, it's macroevolution, because kind isn't a term in science.
It's why dogs look different, people look different, but they're still dogs, they're still people. And microevolution, which is only variation with a kind, cannot produce macroevolution.
Except that once you have enough microevolution in a particular group, you get a new species. And that's what macroevolution is. Unless McMurtry wants to show why speciation can't happen, even though it's been observed in real time both in the lab and in nature, then microevolution absolutely can and does lead to macroevolution.
Evolutionists cannot adequately answer the question, where did the original information that is being copied come from?
Well, even if we had a good definition for information in this case, and it were true that with that, science didn't have a good explanation for where the first of it came from, so what? You can know who your grandparents are without knowing where your 40 times great-grandparents came from. Similarly, you can tell a car lost traction on an icy patch of the road and drove into a ditch if you find it that way without knowing where the car was coming from. The inability of science to know the origin of a thing says nothing about its ability to describe that thing or even its history up to a point.
I have defeated major evolutionists in debate.
Citation needed.
Simply by saying, please tell me, Professor so-and-so, where did the information we are copying come from? Because you've got to copy previously existing information, either perfectly or imperfectly.
That's right. You can't explain a car crash unless you know where the car came from. Oh wait, nope. That's dumb. That's not how anything works.
And no one has ever given me an answer to this question that will then prove that evolution is true.
Well, science doesn't prove things, and expecting it to makes you sound like a flat earther, which really is only different from young Earth creationism in terms of funding and how long it's been non-viable.
Finally, on this point, since 1910, we've done over 3,000 mutations that have been documented in fruit flies, yet there is no documentation of a fruit fly evolving into something else.
Right, because a fruit fly evolving to not be a fruit fly would violate one of those basic aspects of evolution, that it's about branching within already established clades. If fruit flies evolved into something that wasn't a fruit fly, it would fundamentally disconfirm evolution. It would almost certainly be a miracle.
We have done things to fruit flies that ought to be illegal. We have hit them with x-rays, We've hit them with toxic chemicals. We've hit them with the heel of our shoe. We've done things to fruit flies that just ought to be illegal, immoral, and unethical. But the fact of the matter is, we've produced over 3,000 documented specific variations or mutations in the fruit flies. But they've never changed anything else.
Right, because that's how evolution works.
I mean, we have absolutely done things that are just cruel. I mean, we've had legs grow out through the middle of eyes. We've had, we've had fruit flies with short wings, curly wings, no wings. I mean, what do you call a fly with no wings? A crawl?
A stolen joke.
They got flies with no wings at all. What do you call that? A crawl or a walk? Can't fly.
Let's think about this.
That'd be a first for Grady here.
This is a normal fruit fly here. This is a fly with curly wings, but it can't fly. This is one with short wings, but it can't fly. And of course, one without wings can't fly either. And I'd like to share a quotation from the great evolutionist Pierre-Paul Grosset. Now, he's at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He wrote a book called Evolution of Living Organisms that was published in 1977.
Nearly half a century ago. Great. Do you think creationists know that science is still happening in present year? They seem not to.
In that book, he said this, quote, "The fruit fly, the favorite pet insect of the geneticists, whose geographical, biotopical, urban, and rural genotypes are now known inside and out, seems not to have changed since the remotest times."
Cool. There is no minimum pace for morphological change in evolution. Stabilizing selection occurs when an organism is well adapted to its current niche and the fitness landscape for that organism is relatively stable. That this is the case for the fruit fly is neither surprising nor a problem for science.
Well, he's just said, in spite of everything we know, every mutation we've made, we've never changed fruit flies into anything else. Not in nature, not in the laboratory.
Actually, it doesn't seem like he said that. It seems more likely that he was talking about the history, not the present, of fruit flies. But then his book isn't publicly available, neither is it a peer-reviewed work, nor was it taken seriously by basically anyone. And why is this? Because Pierre-Paul Grosset was basically the last of the neo-Lamarckists. He was essentially a pseudoscientist by the time this book was written. The only people I can find citing him for anything are creationists, and they all are openly just getting this quotation from Frank Sherwin. He's one of the morons in my series, Amazing Animals, Obvious Evolution. Near as I can tell, this is a quote mine from a highly dubious source.
Now, this is a biology textbook from 1996. In there is the electron microphotograph here of a fruit fly. But this fruit fly is interesting because it has a mutation with an extra pair of wings. Okay, so these are the regular wings here, but it has an extra pair of wings back there. Now, here's the thing. One evolutionist said, well, you know, the extra pair of wings would allow the fruit fly to fly at higher elevations. Fruit flies would be able to survive above 7,000 feet of elevation.
Who said that? When? And in what publication? I think it was no one, because dipterans lost the ability to control their rear wings for flight after turning them into halteres that are used as sensory organs to keep flight stability when flying with the anterior wings. I think McMurtry just made this up because he's a liar.
The problem with that, of course, is that no fruit fly lives above 7,000 feet of elevation because they all freeze to death.
No. The problem is that this is not something anyone said, because notice how he's happy to cite sources when he has one, but for this it's just one evolutionist. Yeah, that's not a citation. You know, one creationist once told me that God isn't real, evolution totally happened, and that anyone who believes in Noah is actually a liar and a thief. Guess that proves it. Time for all the creationists to go home. Oh wait, you don't believe me? Why, how could that be? I mean, I told you one creationist said it. That should be enough authority.
And this fly cannot fly. It can only hop.
I don't think it can even hop, because flies don't hop. They walk, or crawl if you want to use that word.
And no normal fruit fly will mate with it.
I'd like to see that citation too. Weird how we just kind of abandon the idea that we should have citations, isn't it?
Well, so would this mutation be passed on in nature? Well, obviously not.
Yeah, it wouldn't, and no one has ever claimed that every mutation would be. This is like saying that cats don't exist because you own a dog. Finding an example of a non-cat doesn't mean cats don't exist.
Now, in the textbook it says this: normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4, as clearly seen on the picture. The textbook then says this rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful.
Which is wrong, because most mutations are in fact neither harmful nor beneficial. They are neutral.
So even the textbook admits most mutations are harmful, although actually all are harmful.
Yes, the mutations in the E. coli in the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment that allowed them to metabolize citrate in the presence of oxygen, thereby leading to a significant increase in fitness, were harmful to those bacteria. No, wait, they were actually very beneficial. Whoops.
And then it says this in a very optimistic tone: Beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Well, here we're taking a look at survival of the fittest, but, well, let's think for a second.
He said that before and proceeded to not think. I'm not holding out much hope for this time.
This is not macroevolution. This is the accidental duplication of previously existing information. Is that correct? I mean, the information for wings already existed. Is that correct? This is just the accidental duplication of previously existing information.
Well, first, no one to my knowledge is claiming that this is macroevolution. Why would someone do that? This isn't a new species, so of course it's microevolution at best. But also, no, it's not a duplication of information. It's actually the loss of function of the Hox gene, ultrabithorax, which modifies the development of the second of the 3 thoracic segments into a smaller segment, bearing the halteres, that allow the fly to balance. So without this Hox gene, the embryonic fly falls back on the default development, which is normally only expressed in the first thoracic segment. This really isn't hard to find out either, and it really doesn't harm Grady's argument. He just chose to not bother finding out if he's right or not. Once again, I asked the creationists who might be watching this, does it bother you that creationists so often just don't actually care to look into the claims they make and simply assume that their understanding of a field is adequate, despite often being obviously inadequate? What do you think accounts for this? Could it be that the position they take is broadly wrong? After all, people who know what they're talking about and are right tend not to make basic mistakes so ubiquitously.
It's not beneficial. It's lethal.
If it were actually lethal, you couldn't just get images of the fly, because it would have failed to develop into a living imago. It might be highly detrimental in most environments, but that's not the same thing.
And let's talk about vestigial organs. Now, Charles Darwin considered the existence of vestigial organs to be an absolutely essential proof to evolution.
For the 4th time, not proof. He considered it an important piece of evidence. Science doesn't do proof.
Now, what are vestigial and retrogressive organs?
That's a good question, and it's important to note that they're not the same thing. A vestigial organ is one that is homologous with the organs of other animals that perform some function, but that in the organism in question no longer performs that function. An example might be the wing of an ostrich. It clearly shares the anatomy and basic form of a wing with other birds, but while in most birds the basic function of the wing is to generate lift and thrust to allow flight, in ostriches it does not do this, and so is vestigial. A retrogressive organ is one that is simplified compared to the ancestral trait. For example, tunicates have lost most of the organs that typify chordates as an adult, lacking a notochord and even a brain. But one might also say that a horse leg is retrogressive in that it has gone from having 5 toes to only 1, and therefore is simple compared to the legs of most tetrapods. But it is certainly not vestigial because it retains the normal basic function of tetrapod legs, that is, locomotion. It is important also to note that neither retrogressive organs nor vestigial ones must lack function in order to be either. They must simply be simplified in the case of retrogressive organs, or no longer retain the function of the original organ in the case of vestigial organs.
Well, vestigial means useless, no longer needed. Retrogressive means it was needed, but at the moment it's kind of on the way out.
Why is he so aggressively wrong about basically everything? How could this man be telling the truth about growing up learning evolutionary biology at Berkeley and then teaching it for years, when he evidently knows less about the subject than the average 14-year-old?
Vestigial, no longer needed, useless. Retrogressive, was once useful, now still partly useful, but on the way out.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
Wrong from start to end. Amazing. This bodes ill for any arguments he'll try to make based on the existence of these organisms.
And Charles Darwin said that this was an essential proof of evolution.
I wonder where he said that. It sure would be nice if we got a citation.
His reasoning went like this. He said, if an organ or a structure was still in a human being, that was also in an ape, and the structure was still useful in an ape, but was no longer useful in a human being, it proved that we had evolved past being apes, and we were now evolving into something new, some kind of a superhuman, and so these organs and structures that were no longer needed were phasing out, and new things were evolving. I mean, that's his concept.
Yeah, that's something Grady just made up. That argument is not anywhere that I can find in Darwin's work. But heck, let's just read what he said about the subject. This is from chapter 14 and is the section called Rudimentary, Atrophied, and Aborted Organs. Organs or parts in this strange condition, bearing the plain stamp of inutility, are extremely common, or even general, throughout nature. It would be impossible to name one of the higher animals in which some part or other is not in a rudimentary condition. In the mammalia, for instance, the males possess rudimentary mammae. In snakes, one lobe of the lungs is rudimentary. In birds, the bastard wing may safely be considered as a rudimentary digit. And in some species, the whole wing is so far rudimentary that it cannot be used for flight. What can be more curious than the presence of teeth in fetal whales, which when grown up have not a tooth in their heads, or the teeth which never cut through the gums in the upper jaws of unborn calves? Rudimentary organs plainly declare their origin and meaning in various ways. There are beetles belonging to closely allied species, or even to the same identical species, which have either full-size and perfect wings or mere rudiments of membrane, which not rarely lie under wing covers firmly soldered together. And in these cases, it is impossible to doubt that the rudiments represent wings. Rudimentary organs sometimes retain their potentiality. This occurs naturally with the mammae of male mammals, which have been known to become well-developed and to secrete milk. So again, in the udders of the genus Bos, there are normally 4 developed and 2 rudimentary teeth. But the latter in our domesticated cows sometimes become well-developed and yield milk. In regards to plants, the petals are sometimes rudimentary and sometimes well-developed in the individuals of the same species. In certain plants having separated sexes, Kohlreuter found that by crossing a species, in which the male flowers included a rudiment of a pistil, with a hermaphrodite species, having of course a well-developed pistil, the rudiment in the hybrid offspring was much decreased in size, and this clearly shows that the rudimentary and perfect pistils are essentially alike in nature. An animal may possess various parts in a perfect state, and yet they may in one sense be rudimentary, for they are useless. Thus the tadpole of the common salamander, or water newt, as Mr. G.H. Lewes remarks, has gills and passes its existence in the water, but Salamandra atra, which lives high up among the mountains, brings forth its youth fully formed. This animal never lives in the water. Yet if we open a gravid female, we find tadpoles inside her with exquisitely feathered gills, and when placed in the water, they swim about like the tadpoles of the water newt. Obviously, this aquatic organization has no reference to the future life of the animal, nor has it any adaptation to its embryonic condition. It has solely reference to ancestral adaptations. It repeats a phase of the development of its progenitors. An organ serving for 2 purposes may become rudimentary or utterly aborted for one, even the more important purpose, and remain perfectly efficient for the other. Thus in plants, the office of the pistil is to allow the pollen tubes to reach the ovules within the ovarium. The pistil consists of a stigma supported on the style, but in some compositae, the male florets, which of course cannot be fecundated, have a rudimentary pistil. For it is not crowned with stigma, but the style remains well developed and is clothed in the usual manner with hairs, which serve to brush pollen out of the surrounding and conjoined anthers. Again, an organ may become rudimentary for its proper purpose, and be used for a distinct one. In certain fishes, the swim bladder seems to be rudimentary for its proper function of giving buoyancy, but has become converted into a nascent breathing organ or lung. Many similar instances could be given. Useful organs, however little they may be developed, unless we have reason to suppose that they were formerly more highly developed, ought not to be considered as rudimentary. They may be in a nascent condition and in progress towards further development. Rudimentary organs, on the other hand, are either quite useless, such as teeth which never cut through the gums, or almost useless, such as the wings of an ostrich, which serve merely as sails. As organs in this condition would formerly, when still less developed, have been of even less use than at present, they cannot formerly have been produced through the variation and natural selection, which acts solely by the preservation of useful modifications. They have been partially retained by the power of inheritance and relate to a former state of things. It is, however, often difficult to distinguish between rudimentary and nascent organs, for we can judge only by analogy whether a part is capable of further development, in which case alone it deserves to be called nascent. Organs in this condition will always be somewhat rare, for being thus provided will commonly have been supplanted by their succession with the same organ in a more perfect state, and consequently will have become long ago extinct. The wing of the penguin is of high service, acting as a fin. It may therefore represent the nascent state of the wing. Not that I believe this to be the case. It is more probably a reduced organ, modified for a new function. The wing of Apteryx, on the other hand, is quite useless and is truly rudimentary. Owen considers the simple filamentary limbs of a lepidosiren as the beginnings of organs which attain a fully functional development in higher vertebrates, but according to the view lately advocated by Dr. Gunther, they are probably remnants consisting of the persistent axis of a fin with lateral rays or branches aborted. The mammary glands of Ornithorhynchus may be considered in comparison with the udders of a cow as in a nascent condition. The ovigerous frena of certain cirripedes, which have ceased to give attachment to the ova and are feebly developed, are nascent branchiae. Rudimentary organs in individuals of the same species are very liable to vary in the degree of their development and in other respects. In closely allied species also, the extent to which the same organ has been reduced occasionally differs much. This latter fact is well exemplified in the state of the wings of female moths belonging to the same family. Rudimentary organs may be utterly aborted, and this implies that in certain animals or plants, parts are entirely absent, which analogy would lead us to expect to find in them, and which are occasionally found in monstrous individuals. Thus, in most of the Scrophulariaceae, the 5th stamen is utterly aborted, and yet we may conclude that a 5th stamen once existed, for a rudiment of it is found in many places of the family, and this rudiment occasionally becomes perfectly developed, as may sometimes be seen in the common snapdragon. In tracing the homologies of any part in different members of the same class, nothing is more common, or in order fully to understand the relations of the parts more useful than the discovery of rudiments. This is well shown in the drawings given by Owen of the leg bones of the horse, ox, and rhinoceros. It is an important fact that rudimentary organs such as teeth in the upper jaws of whales and remnants can often be detected in embryo but afterwards wholly disappear. It is also, I believe, a universal rule that a rudimentary part is of greater size in embryo relative to the adjoining parts than in the adults, so that the organ at this early stage is less rudimentary or even cannot be said to be in any degree rudimentary. Hence, rudimentary organs in the adult are often said to have retained their embryonic condition. I have now given the leading facts with respect to rudimentary organs. In reflecting on them, everyone must be struck with astonishment. The same reasoning power which tells us that most parts and organs are exquisitely adapted for certain purposes tells us with equal plainness that these rudimentary or atrophied organisms are imperfect and useless. In works on natural history, rudimentary organs are generally said to have been created for the sake of symmetry, or in order to complete the scheme of nature. But this is not an explanation, merely a restatement of the fact, nor is it consistent with itself. Thus, the boa constrictor has rudiments of hind limbs and of a pelvis, and if it be said that these bones have been retained to complete the schema of nature, why, as Professor Wiseman asks, have they not been retained by other snakes which do not possess even a vestige of these same bones? What would be thought of the astronomer who maintained that the satellites revolve in elliptic orbits round their planets for the sake of symmetry, because the planets thus revolve around the sun? An eminent physiologist accounts for the presence of rudimentary organs by supposing that they serve to excrete matter in excess, or matter injurious to the system. But can we suppose that minute papillae, which are often present in the pistil of male flowers, and which is formed of mere cellular tissue, can thus act? Can we suppose that rudimentary teeth, which are subsequently absorbed, are beneficial to rapidly growing embryonic calf by removing matter so precious as phosphate of lime? When a man's fingers have been amputated, imperfect nails have been known to appear on the stumps, and it could be assumed believed that these vestiges of nails are developed in order to excrete horny matter, as that the rudimentary nails on the fin of the manatee have been developed for the same purpose. On the view of descent with modification, the origins of rudimentary organs is comparatively simple, and we can understand to a large extent the laws governing their imperfect development. We have plenty of cases of rudimentary organs in our domestic products, such as the stump of tail in tailless breeds, the vestige of an ear in earless breeds of sheep, and the reappearance of minute dangling horns in hornless breeds of cattle, more especially, according to Watt, in young animals, and in the state of the whole flower and the cauliflower. We often see rudiments of various parts in monsters, but I doubt whether any of these cases throw light on the origin of rudimentary organs in a state of nature, further than by showing that rudiments can be produced. For the balance of evidence clearly indicates that species under nature do not undergo great and abrupt changes, but we learn from the study of our domestic products that the disuse of parts leads to their reduced size, and that the result is inherited. It appears probable that disuse has been the main agent in rendering organs rudimentary. It would at first be led by slow steps to the more and more complete reduction of a part, until at last it became rudimentary, as in the case of the eyes of animals inhabiting dark caverns, and of the wings of birds inhabiting oceanic islands, which have seldom been forced by beasts of prey to take flight, and have ultimately lost the power of flying. Again, an organ useful under certain conditions might become injurious under others, as with the wings of beetles living on small and exposed islands, and in this case, natural selection will have aided in reducing the organ until it was rendered harmless and rudimentary. Any change in structure and function which can be effected by small stages is within the power of natural selection, so that an organ rendered through changed habits of life, useless or injurious for one purpose, might be modified and used for another purpose. An organ might also be retained for one alone of its former functions. Organs originally formed by the aid of natural selection, when rendered useless, may well be variable, for their variations can no longer be checked by natural selection. All this agrees well with what we see under nature. Moreover, at whatever period of life either disuse or selection reduces an organ, and this will generally be when the being has come to maturity, and to exert its full powers of action, the principle of inheritance at corresponding ages will tend to reproduce the organ in its reduced state at the same mature age, but will seldom affect it in the embryo. Thus we can understand the greater size of rudimentary organs in the embryo relatively to adjoining parts, and their lesser relative size in the adult, if for instance the digit of an adult animal was used less and less during many generations owing to some change of habits, or if an organ or gland were less and less functionally exercised, we may infer that it would become reduced in size in the adult descendants of this animal, but would retain nearly its original size, but would retain its nearly original standard of development in embryo. There remains, however, this difficulty. After an organ has ceased being used and has become in correspondence much reduced, how can it be further still reduced in size until the merest vestige is left? And how can it be finally quite obliterated? It is scarcely possible that disuse can go on producing any further effect after the organ has been rendered functionless. Some additional explanation is here requisite which I cannot give. If, for instance, it could be proved that every part of the organization tends to vary in a greater degree towards diminution than towards augmentation of size, then we should be able to understand how an organ which has become useless would be rendered, independently of the effects of disuse, rudimentary, and the last would be wholly supposed, for the variations towards diminished size would no longer be checked by natural selection. The principle of economy of growth, explained in a former chapter, by which the materials forming any part, if not useful to the possessor, are saved as far as possible, will perhaps come into play in rendering a useless part rudimentary. But this principle will almost necessarily be confined to the earlier stages of the process of production. For we cannot suppose that a minute papilla, for instance, representing in a male flower the pistil of the female flower, and formed merely of cellular tissue, could be further reduced or absorbed for the sake of economizing nutriment. Finally, as rudimentary organs, by whatever steps they may have been dragged into their present useless condition, are the record of a former state of things, and have been retained solely through the power of inheritance, we can understand on the genealogical view of classification how it is that systematists, in placing organisms in their proper places in the natural system, have often found rudimentary parts as useful as, or even sometimes more useful than, parts of high physiological importance. Rudimentary organs may be compared with the letters in a word still retained in their spelling, but become useless in the pronunciation, but which serve as a clue for its derivation. On the view of descent with modification, we may conclude the existence of organs in rudimentary, imperfect, and useless condition, or quite aborted, far from presenting a strange difficulty, as they assuredly do in the old doctrine of creation, might even have been anticipated in accordance with the views explained here. Isn't it odd how Darwin doesn't actually seem to say what Grady says he says? And of course what Darwin said is only of historical interest, because Darwin is not the Pope, he's not a prophet, and he's not a god. He's just a scientist who got some things right and some things wrong. In fact, he got the idea that the bastard wing of birds is useless wrong. That structure, which is made of the distalmost phalange of the thumb, reduces stall speed, allowing birds to land safely at low speed.
Now, I want to introduce you to Dr. Wiedersheim. In 1895, Dr. Wiedersheim, who was an evolutionary believing anatomist, wrote a book called The Structure of Man.
Oh no, a man in 1895 got some things wrong, and so now science is stuck with them, here nearly 130 years later. Oh wait. No, it's not. It just updates when new data came in. It's that thing that makes science more trustworthy than pseudoscience, the willingness to change when it turns out something is wrong. As we've seen in this series, though, creationists apparently, by and large, don't care about being wrong, or are just too intellectually dishonest to notice when they are.
In that book, he listed 186 organs or structures in the human body. There was 100 vestigial, no longer needed, and 86 retrogressive, partially useful, but on the way out.
Which, again, isn't what those words mean, not even to Darwin.
In the book, he listed the pituitary gland. Now, first of all, if I take out your pituitary gland, you're going to die. He also listed the pineal gland, tonsils, wisdom teeth, human hair, small toes, coccyx, thymus gland, notochord, appendix, well, and the little gland in your eye that produces sleep. He listed as just some of the 186. Now, for instance, if you don't think you don't need small toes, we'll be very happy to amputate them on the way out from the presentation.
Humans don't need their small toes. In fact, a human can lose any toe and be back to normal in about 2 months, with most of the adjustment and healing being accomplished in the first 3 or 4 weeks. It's not unusual for a human to be back to their normal routine within 4 weeks of the amputation of a toe. That being said, I can't imagine why someone would opt to go through with the recovery of surgery just to prove a point to Grady. You also don't need any given hair, and hairs fall out all the time. This doesn't mean that Grady would let me pull at his hair just to prove that he doesn't need one of them. This is far more serious than that.
And you will have to learn how to walk all over again from scratch.
Nope, you won't. In fact, a toe amputation doesn't even normally require physical therapy. Once the wound is healed, you'll be walking just fine in virtually all cases. Toe amputation is even considered a minor surgery.
Well, let's think here for a second.
He keeps saying that, but then making no apparent effort to actually do that thinking.
What about the appendix? I mean, you've all heard the appendix is a useless, functionless organ that don't need it and so forth.
Well, you don't need it. People routinely live long, healthy lives without it, but it does have a few functions, as I'm sure we're about to hear about.
As a matter of fact, in this biology textbook here, it compares a human to a horse for some reason. I'm not sure why, but...
Because in a horse, the appendix is used to help digest tough plant matter, and at the time it was printed in 1994, it was thought the appendix in mammals was widely homologous. Turns out that doesn't seem to be the case, with more recent studies, such as multiple independent appearances of the cecal appendix in mammalian evolution and an investigation of related ecological and anatomical factors, Smith et al. 2013, and morphological evolution of mammalian cecum and cecal appendix, Smith et al. 2017. Once again, science adapting to new evidence and becoming better. Grady should take notes.
Notice it says, compared with the cecum of a horse, the appendix of humans is thought to be vestigial, no longer needed. But this comes from a book called Fully Functional by Dr. Jerry Bergman. And, quote, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. As a matter of fact, today we now know that the immune system in babies is highly dependent upon the appendix.
Well, first, New Scientist is not a peer-reviewed source, and neither is the textbook Grady was referencing. Second, I have not been able to find this article online, even behind the New Scientist paywall. The only places I can see it being cited are Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International, neither of which link to an online version. Oddly, the CMI article quotes from an article that has a different number from the one they cite, and that does exist, but does not contain the quotation McMurtry is using. In the article I could find, it does quote Johann Uys as saying, in humans it was thought to have no physiological function. However, it is now known to play a role in fetal immunity and in young adults. During the early years of development, the appendix functions as a lymphoid organ, assisting with the maturation of B lymphocytes, a type of white blood cell, and in the production of immunoglobulin A antibodies. In addition, at around the 11th week of fetal development, endocrine, hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. These cells produce peptide hormones that control various biological mechanisms. I have no idea who this is, other than a South African man who is, for some reason, writing for New Scientist. Further, searching for the exact wording McMurtry used brings up articles about the appendix, but none that contain the exact wording. I suspect that exact wording does not actually exist anywhere, and that this is another instance of the well-known phenomenon of creationists getting quotations badly wrong, and then other creationists just copying the bad quotation and citation without ever bothering to check the original source. All this being said, I can't find much to confirm that the appendix is especially important for fetal development, but I also don't find that claim very extraordinary, and so unless I can find something more, I don't really plan to dispute it.
Notice that this is from New Scientist, an evolutionary publication.
Well, so he says. Again, I can't find that exact phrasing anywhere, and other citations with exactly the same sources he's using link to an article that doesn't say that. But yes, New Scientist doesn't, as far as I can tell, generally support pseudoscience such as flat earth, homeopathy, geocentrism, dowsing, or young earth creationism.
During fetal development, and endocrine hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. So during fetal development, endocrine hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. These cells produce peptide hormones that control various biological functions.
That does seem to be true, and it's news to me. It looks like it's been confirmed a few times, but again, this isn't terribly surprising, as we now know that rather than being a widely distributed plesiomorphic trait of primates, the appendix is a conversion feature and probably not vestigial, because it was probably never used for the fermentation of rough plant matter. After this, he makes a citation to a Dr. Ron Aller. I have no idea who that is, nor can I seem to find him, and then Walt Brown. Yes, that Walt Brown. Of lunar bukkake fame. Anyway, because I do not dispute that the appendix is not well characterized as vestigial, I'm not sure what the point is.
And what about, well, the coccyx? Now, people incorrectly call the coccyx a tailbone. Well, it's not a tailbone.
Yeah, but is it though? So here's a human embryo with a tail. A tail is just an extension of the spine posterior to the anus. And that's what this is. It's also the tissue from which the coccyx grows. So the coccyx absolutely is a tailbone. In fact, it technically is the tail in a human. It just is internal after a very small amount of embryonic development.
Has nothing to do with a tail. Never did, never will.
I can't with this guy anymore. He's much too dumb.
And, well, here's a picture of the supposed tailbone, though that's not what it is at all. It's actually a very cleverly designed structure.
It's a tailbone, even if it's cleverly designed. Which it's not, but whatever.
But in Discover magazine, June 2004, they said this, that it's all that's left of the tail that most mammals still use. Well, first of all, it was never a tail, and it isn't today. And here's another biology textbook. Notice here it says, humans have a tailbone with no apparent use.
Oh no, a biology textbook for babies from almost 3.5 decades ago got it slightly wrong because the coccyx is indeed used as an anchor point for some muscles. Whatever shall we do? Besides, I don't know, maybe stop looking at texts for babies and see what the state of the field in current year is? And look, I'm not happy with how out-of-date textbooks are, and I do not think that science education in the United States is doing as good a job as it should. But this guy isn't a school teacher, and he's certainly not a school child. He's talking to adults, and he should be using real sources.
And then the textbook says vestigial tailbones in humans. These vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. Organisms having vestigial structures probably share a common ancestor. That's evolution.
Yep.
Or from this biology textbook, again concerning the coccyx or tailbone.
Oh, this one is slightly less old. Neato.
It has no present function. Remainder of bones, long tail of a tree-dwelling ancestor. They want to make people just monkeys or apes. Actually, Charles Darwin said people evolved from monkeys. People will say he meant apes. I don't know whether he meant it or not, but he wrote monkeys.
Well, people are monkeys and apes, although I'm not sure why we need to add just in front of it, as if being a monkey or an ape were some lowly or embarrassing thing. Look, what do I know? I'm a ceratosaurus. I bite the heads off of sauropods. But even not I'm such a gigantic dick as to say that monkeys suck for no reason. Monkeys are cool.
Just monkeys or apes. Actually, Charles Darwin said people evolved from monkeys. People will say he meant apes. I don't know whether he meant it or not, but he wrote monkeys.
Well, Grady has already repeatedly shown he's happy to just lie about Darwin, so let's find out. In Chapter 1 of Descent of Man, he says, the correspondence in general structure, in the minute structures of tissues, in chemical composition, and in constitution between man and the higher animals, especially the anthropomorphous apes, is extremely close. In Chapter 6, he says, it would be beyond my limits and quite beyond my knowledge even to name the innumerable points of structure in which man agrees with the other primates. Our great anatomist and philosopher, Professor Huxley, has fully discussed the subject, and concludes that man in all parts of his organization differs less from the higher apes than these do from the lower members of the same group. Consequently, there is no justification for placing man in a distinct order. He seems pretty clear on what he's talking about, and like for at least the third time, Grady McMurtry is just lying about Darwin, who I will remind everyone yet again is not the Messiah, he's not the Pope, he's not Rasul al-Ilm, he's just a guy who got some important stuff right, got plenty of stuff wrong, as we've already seen, and is historically, but no longer scientifically, important.
And let's examine the evidence.
You mean like the fact that the coccyx absolutely is a tailbone that starts out as an actual external tail?
There is no genetic evidence for a method whereby useless organs will necessarily deteriorate. We've never found a mechanism that would allow for the deterioration of anything.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Isn't the whole creationist thing that he's been arguing for that all mutations are harmful or make things degenerate? But anyway, Shah et al. In 2021 actually found that the insertion of an ALU-derived intron in the TBXT gene in apes, humans included, disrupts the formation of the tail, and this was studied by mimicking this mutation in the genomes of lab mice, who then went on to have severely reduced tails or simply no tails at all, and even in some rare cases developed spinal birth defects that occur in about 0.1% of human births, again related to the tail. So we have a really good idea of the exact genetic mechanism right down to the specific mutation, the specific gene involved in tail loss. Okay, but let's also unpack that in terms of creationism. So without the extra intron, the TBXT gene, common in all primates and even in rodents, results in a long tail. Now, according to creationists, Adam and Eve are a separate creation from all other apes, but all apes have the same intron inserted into a gene that without it would result in a functional tail. So were apes and humans separately created with tails, and then they both independently had the same ALU insert into their TBXT genes in the same place? And if apes are actually two kinds, with gibbons being in one kind and the great apes, less humans, in another, did it happen 3 times independently? That's wildly unlikely. Did God just create 3 different groups of animals with otherwise functional TBXT genes only for him to break each one in the same way? That's certainly not anything one would predict on the basis of special creation. Of course, it doesn't just stop there. The gulo pseudogene is the remnants of a gene that in most mammals makes vitamin C, but in tarsiers and monkeys, apes included, yes, even humans, it's broken in exactly the same way. So there are now 6 distinct created kinds, according to most creationists, that, all happen to independently break their vitamin C gene in the exact same way, while also being taxonomically united as a group that evolution would see as monophyletic without this particular gene breakage? Yeah, sure, that checks out. That doesn't sound post hoc in the least.
The function of an organ may not yet be discovered. What if you have a vestigial retrogressive organ as they're named?
Again, something can be vestigial without being retrogressive, and it can be retrogressive without being vestigial. And some organs can be both. I'd argue most organs that are one are probably both, but that is not a requirement.
But you don't know the function for it. You don't know for use of it and so forth. What does that really prove?
Well, ignoring the word prove, it shows that unlike what would be expected from intelligent design, The creature in question is evidently descended from organisms with a more well-developed organ of the same kind that is used for the typical purpose, showing that this organism shares common ancestry with such creatures for whom the organ in question is neither vestigial nor retrogressive.
What it really proves is we've just not been smart enough to figure it out yet. Is that correct?
In some cases, sure.
So it doesn't mean it doesn't have a function. It just simply means we haven't been smart enough to figure out what it is.
Maybe, but it also could just mean that the structure in question just doesn't have a function. It's hard to see what the purpose of the collapsed lung of a snake or the atrophied and not productive ovary of a bird would have. Maybe there's something that they're really vitally important for, or even just a bit important for. But I doubt it.
Now, I have a different opinion. As a creationist, I figure if there's a structure or an organ there, God put it there and it has a reason. Whether I've been smart enough to figure it out or not is irrelevant.
It's also irrelevant to the question of whether the structure is vestigial or retrogressive.
I think it had one, still does.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
No one cares, Grady. You're a demonstrable liar and idiot.
And the function of an organ may be taken up by another organ when it is removed. For example, aren't you glad you have 2 kidneys?
No, that's not what it means. It's not talking about redundant paired organs. It's saying that, hey, when turtles become more and more aquatic, eventually the anal end of their digestive tract started to take oxygen up from the water so that they could stay underwater longer, thereby taking up some of the function of the lungs. Or when birds lost the ability that's common in most other reptiles to breathe by using muscles that going from the spine to the ribs to expand their rib cages, other muscles in the throat as well as in the limbs took over the respiration duties. A lung or a kidney just doing more lung or kidney stuff isn't a different organ taking over. It's the same organ just doing more.
Or how about the spleen? You can remove the spleen, but then the liver kind of picks up the function and so forth.
There it is. Gold star to Grady.
So God has built-in redundancy here because think about it. If you lost just one of these things, well, you would die, but God has built in these, systems that they can overlap. And the list of useful structures has decreased to 0.
I think he means useless, but also that's not true. There's no function to the ear muscles that humans can use to ever so slightly raise their ears. The palmaris longus muscle of the arm produces no actual effect, and some 15% of humans don't even have it. It's so useless it gets used for grafting, with no long-term effects on mobility after removal. That's just 2 right there.
As our knowledge has increased, today we know of at least 1 or more valuable functions for every structure or organ listed by Dr. Wiedersheim in his book. So after 100 years of research, the number's down to 0.
Oh, maybe, yeah, the ones in his book. I don't know. I don't care. I'm not going to go read a century-old book on human anatomy when there are new sources and they directly contradict Grady's points.
What about vestigial structures in other creatures? I mean, again, evolutionists are always pointing at these things. For example, they talk about the, quote, hip bones, unquote, in whales, or they'll talk about the spurs in snakes. They will say these hip bones are the leftover pelvis from a cow.
No, not a cow. Cows and whales are both artiodactyls, but whales are most closely related to hippos, forming the clade Whippomorpha. The next group closest after hippos is the ruminants, as a whole, including the cows and bovidae, but also Giraffidae, Antilocapridae, Moschidae, and Cervidae. So a whale is no more closely related to a cow than it is to a giraffe, a pronghorn, a musk deer, or a moose. And the common ancestor of a whale and a cow was neither a cow nor a whale. This isn't really all that complicated, but hey, it wouldn't be young Earth creationism if it didn't get almost everything wrong for basically no reason.
They'll say the spurs are just leftover legs from when snakes had legs.
Because they develop from the embryonic hind limb buds, and they even have unguals, the toe bones that bear claws. They're absolutely hind legs, and they are absolutely useless for the normal thing hind legs do. Help the animal walk. The spurs even attach to little pelvic bones.
But let's take a look at the truth. Now, this is a textbook showing the supposed evolution of snakes, whales, and horses. In the textbook right here it says, whales and snakes have vestigial hip bones and leg bones. Horses once had 4 functional toes. Now they walk on just 1 toe. The others are no longer functional. Now, let me stop for just a minute and ask a question. If horses started out with 4 toes, they now have 1 toe. Please tell me, is that the adding of information or the subtracting of previously existing information?
I would love to be able to answer that question, but since we have no way to measure the information in a genome that creationists have ever accepted, There's no way to know for sure. I, however, suspect that measuring the genome either in terms of number of functional elements, or in terms of gross genome length, or in terms of size of all functional elements, which are the only ways that I can think of to objectively measure such a thing, that it's neither a loss nor a gain, and is simply a different way the same information is expressed, especially since different digits all form from basically the same Hox genes.
Well, it would be the subtraction of previously existing information, is that correct?
Maybe, but I doubt it. Sure would be nice if we had, I don't know, a way to check.
Now, I don't think that's how horses came into existence.
Interesting, because at least Answers in Genesis seems to think that horses originally had at least 3 toes, as you can see in this picture of their horse-kind ancestors on the Ark encounter. In fact, they just put Mesohippus on the Ark and called it good.
But that wouldn't be getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. That would be getting smaller, slower, and dumber.
Horses are some of the fastest animals on Earth specifically because of their one toe, and they are also some of the largest land animals on the planet, and they're also extremely intelligent and can learn many tricks from human trainers, and can also manage complex social hierarchies and interactions in herds. Unless Grady here has some new evidence that Mesohippus was bigger, faster, and smarter than a modern horse, which seems far-fetched given how small it was, I'm going to have to say that he's just making things up again at best, and at worst is just knowingly lying. Does he think that if you lose a finger, some IQ points go with it or something? Is brain power stored in the toes? Is pee stored in the balls? That's the level we're operating at here.
And what about snakes? This is another textbook right here on biology. And here it's showing an illustration of the 2 spurs and pythons and so forth. And the textbook says that these are rudimentary hind legs. Well, they're not rudimentary hind legs. Snakes never had legs to start with.
Then why do they grow limb buds in embryo that in some snakes turn into spurs? Oh right, because they absolutely did have legs. In fact, most Christians tend to think that snakes had legs in the Garden of Eden, but lost them when God cursed them to crawl on their bellies after a serpent tricked Eve into eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil by... Let me check. Oh, right, telling her the truth.
And evolutionists will say these are just the deteriorated hind legs.
No, they're not just that. They retain functions in mating and in interspecific competition for mates, which they also probably had before they became useless for locomotion. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that real scientists say the word just a whole lot less than you'd think if you listen to Grady here.
Now, here's a close-up photograph of a boa constrictor, python skin here, with these spurs. Now, evolutionists say that these are just the decay of a previous structure.
No, decay is what happens to things when they die, not what happens to structures as they become vestigial. They're the vestiges of functional locomotory organs that retain some secondary functions, but have clearly lost the primary function such organs fulfill in other organisms with homologous organs.
But actually, they're absolutely essential to various kinds of snakes. You see, the male uses these spurs to manipulate the female for copulation. Without them, the snakes can't mate. Now, I think you'll agree with me, if you're a snake, that's really important. So they do have a known function, but they're not the rudiments of something else.
Yeah, I'm sure a pelvic structure from which extends a series of bones ending in a claw that's closely associated with the anus, after which a post-anal tail extends, and that develops from hind limb buds in embryo, has nothing at all to do with legs.
This isn't some deteriorated structure. It's a very wise design.
I would love it if he had something other than just nuh-uh for the spurs of snakes not being legs.
And here, now, we have a dictionary on science that says again about the word vestigial. It says whales, for example, have small bones located in the muscles of their body walls that are vestigial bones of hips and hind limbs. Well, I disagree with that statement, but this is what the Science Dictionary said in 2005.
Disagree all you like, but they're still, just like snake spurs, bones that are derived from the hind limb buds in embryo are associated with morphologically distinct vertebrae that are sacral vertebrae, that is hip vertebrae, and the anus is near those bones, and posterior to those bones, the vertebrae are caudal. So it's pretty conclusive that these bones are hip and limb bones.
Now, there are groups of people who will still tell you that whales evolved from cows.
No, because that was never the consensus, or even a hypothesis. That's just a straw man. As I've already gone over.
Now, I would like all of you to do an interesting little experiment. In your head, I would like you to just fast as you can, in your mind, see a creature that's half cow, half whale. Got it? Now, according to evolutionists, that would be a transitional form.
Jesus Christ, no. Cows and whales are both independently derived artiodactyls. A half cow, half whale would falsify evolution. Why is it every time a creationist tries to explain the predictions of evolution or imagines what might be evidence of evolution, they come up with something that would directly contradict evolution?
Somehow, no, there's a mixture between a cow becoming a whale, and there's a transitional form of the two. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've never found any such creature.
Look, it's been a while, so let's have the transitional fossil slideshow, and I'll highlight the transitional whales.
This is believed in by faith.
Yeah, Pakicetus, Nalacetus, Ichthyolestes, Ambulocetus, Dandacasia, Himalayacetus, Andrewcephus, Atokacetus, Dalanestes, Cuchacetus, Remingtonocetus, Aegicetus, Babiacetus, Carolinacetus, Georgiacetus, Pontobacilius, Macaracetus, Egyptocetus, Ardiocetus, Cronatocetus, Dedicetus, Indocetus, Malacetus, Paragocetus, Protocetus, Kaisercetus, Rhodocetus, Tacrocetus, Togocetus, Basilosaurus, Basiloterus, Eocetus, Ancalocetus, Basilotritus, Chrysocetus, Synthiocetus, Dorudon, Mastrocetus, Okukayea, Sagacetus, Stromerius, Supayacetus, Zygorrhiza, and Kekenodon are all just things that don't exist and people only believe in them based on faith. That's exactly how it works.
And here are some biology textbooks just to prove it. This is from 2006. Here is this whale, and you see these hip bones in the back end here. They say, well, these are the vestigial hip bones and so forth, when the whale was a cow. And they say that's just the pelvis that is deteriorating away. This is actually a university-level textbook from 2005. Again, we see a similar drawing of a whale with these hip bones in the back, as they call them. And they say, again, that this is just a deterioration. Or here's another one. This is from 1989, but again, we have a whale with these pelvic and femur bones back here. And it says this: many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. So many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges.
Oh, for f***'s sake, how many examples does he need to make his point?
Another one, 1998. We see the same thing here. The textbook says, whales have a vestigial pelvis and leg bones that serve no purpose. These structures are evidence of the whale's evolution from four-legged land-dwelling animals. Here's another one. Notice what it says here. Modern whales have hind limbs which have been reduced to only a few tiny internal hind limb bones that have no function. Okay, now we're getting to the vestigial. And I love this one. This is a textbook for children, and it says here, just imagine whales walking around. It's true. Well, no, it's not true. It's a lie.
I can't wait for Grady to open a movie theater because he's an expert at projection.
Just imagine whales walking around. It's true.
Also, he steals material from Kent Hovind. You know, the guy who drove the Baptist grape bus. Except remove the G from great. Imagine being so bad at your job that you're a bad copycat of the guy even other pseudoscientists avoid because he's just too dumb.
You have to imagine this. There's no science to support this. That's faith.
You know what? Here's Dapper from the very recent past. Yeah, Pakicetus, Nalacetus, Ichthyolestes, Ambulocetus, Gondocassia, Himalayacetus, Andrewcephus, Atokacetus, Delanestes, Cuchacetus, Remingtonocetus, Aegicetus, Babiacetus, Carolinacetus, Georgiacetus, Pontobacillius, Macaracetus, Egyptocetus, Ardiocetus, Cronatocetus, Dedicetus, Indocetus, Malacetus, Paragocetus, Protocetus, Kaisercetus, Rhodocetus, Tacrocetus, Togocetus, Basilosaurus, Basiloterus, Eocetus, Ancalocetus, Basilotritus, Chrysocetus, Synthiocetus, Dorudon, Mastrocetus, Okukayea, Sagacetus, Stromerius, Supayacetus, Zygorrhiza, and Kekenodon are all just things that don't exist and people only believe in them based on faith. That's exactly how it works.
Now here at the Los Angeles, California Museum of Natural History, we see an actual whale skeleton, and you can actually see here are the actual bones that they're talking about. That's what they really do look like.
Hey, he just displayed on screen the transition from sacral to caudal vertebrae associated with the pelvic bones. Always nice when the creationist shows how they're wrong on their own slides. Makes my job easier.
But think with me for a moment.
Hey, maybe this time he'll actually think. There's a first time for everything, you know?
Here in this textbook page, it says such structures which are considered to be evidence of an organism's evolutionary past are called vestigial structures. But the fact of the matter is that actually there are no such things as vestigial organs.
That's odd because he's showing us some right now, and unless he can show us a modern whale walking with those hips and legs, they're definitely vestigial.
Even if there were, that would be the opposite of evolution.
Evolution is at a minimum a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. This seems like it would certainly be the result of that, so yes, it is evolution. Good to know that the threatened thinking still isn't occurring.
And let's talk about whales for just a second.
I hear it's a lovely place, full of interesting people who are certainly not doing anything untoward with sheep.
Those bones in the back end of a whale.
Oh, we're still on the animals. Even after he showed great evidence that pelvic and hind limb bones are exactly what science knows them to be, pelvic and hind limb bones. Oh well, let's hear it.
Are not the deteriorated, disintegrating hip and pelvis bones of a cow or something like that.
Right, because whales didn't evolve from cows.
Those bones are actually useful to the whale in two ways. Number one, the whale uses those bones, again, in copulation. Without those bones, a whale can't mate. So again, if you're a whale, I think that's a really important feature.
I feel like pointing out that a mammal finds its pelvic bones important for mating isn't exactly new. Now, maybe Grady has just never actually had a sexual encounter with another mammal in his life, but presumably he at least understands the basics of the idea, right? Does he think that mammal reproduction normally just doesn't involve the hip bones or the legs? That seems pretty far-fetched. Nothing about retaining the usefulness in mating that all mammal hips have makes them not pelvic bones, but they still don't have the locomotor function, so they're still vestigial.
But there's something else too. Those bones are actually a pivot point which a mechanical engineer would admire. Because you see, whales are mammals and their tail goes up and down like so. And, well, if you don't have those bones right there, then the muscles that would require the whale's tail to go up and down would have to extend from one end of the animal to the other. The muscles would become so large, a whale couldn't exist.
I'm sorry, so is the argument now that they can't be pelvic bones because tail muscles attach to them? Does he think that that's not how normal pelvises work? Honestly, why does he keep pointing out ways in which the bones act like pelvic bones in order to say that they're not pelvic bones? Or is he saying that they are, but they're not vestigial because they retain some but not all of the functions of a pelvis? Well, if that's the argument, it's still pretty darn dumb, because that's what vestigial structures are.
But because of these bones being a pivot point, you have muscles going from the front to the bones, and then another muscle goes from the bone to the tip of the tail, and because of this, the muscles can be much smaller and they can fit inside the whale. So these are a cleverly designed engineering pivot point to attach the muscles that go to both ends of the body, which allow a whale to actually live.
This just in, abdominal muscles attach the pelvis of whales, just like, in other animals with a pelvis. Is he even trying? This is just the third pelvis thing he's pointed out about whales to say that they don't have vestigial pelvises. Grady, if you watch this, which you probably won't, in the future, maybe don't do my job for me.
And so it's a very good design feature. And so the whale needs them for two reasons.
Pointing out that a vestigial structure exists but is still important isn't good evidence of design. What about all the sea life that manages to get along just fine without a pelvis? What, did God just decide one day to have a goof and give the whales a pelvis, but not to bother with, say, whale sharks? Is this different design evidence of different designers?
Now let's talk about the recapitulation theory of embryonic development, or as Ernst Haeckel called it, the biogenetic law.
Why? Haeckel's biogenetic laws have been known to be false for like a century, and it's not part of science. Oh well, I knew what I was signing up for when I decided to make this series. Let's get into it.
Now, Ernst Haeckel was a direct disciple of Charles Darwin. Origin of Species was published in English in 1859, in the fall of 1859. By 1860, it was already translated into German. Now, Dr. Ernst Haeckel, which, by the way, is one of only two major evolutionists of the 1800s to even have a PhD.
Good thing degrees aren't a requirement to do science, I guess.
Remember that Charles Darwin was not a scientist. His only degree was in theology.
If you do science, you're a scientist. Darwin did science, so he was a scientist. Doesn't matter if you have a degree in it. Degrees help you be better equipped to do good science, but you can still do good science without them. It's like the difference between taking classes in how to code versus being self-taught. If you can code, you can code, and if you're good at it, it doesn't matter if you took a class or not. The proof is in the code you write. Same for science. Degrees help, but if the work is sound, it speaks for itself.
Well, Dr. Ernst Haeckel had a tenured position at Jena University, and he read Darwin. Now, he had grown up in a marginally Christian home, but he read Darwin in 1860 and emphatically became a solid atheistic evolutionist the rest of his life. Now, this is a guy who so believed in evolution, he actually made up 4 different things to support the concept of evolution for which there is no scientific basis.
Sure, Haeckel was the worst man to ever live. He lied about everything. He was possessed by Satan himself, and everything he did was to trick people into going to hell. Guess what? It doesn't matter to science, because science doesn't care what Haeckel thought. In fact, we now know that most of the ideas that we can attribute to him are false.
One of his major frauds is called the biogenetic law.
Not sure getting something wrong constitutes a fraud, but if it does, then I guess Grady McMurtry here is a pretty big fraud and maybe shouldn't be one to talk.
Now, first of all, what does recapitulation theory, what does this terminology ontogeny, recapitulation, phylogeny really mean? I know those are big words for a lot of people. But Ernst Haeckel came up with this recapitulation theory, or it's ontogeny begets phylogeny, or recapitulates phylogeny. What does it all really mean? Well, to make it simple, ontogeny is the biological development of the individual, and Haeckel said that the biological development of the individual, our evolutionary past, recapitulates or is repeated briefly in phylogeny. That's the evolutionary development of the individual.
And he got it backwards. Fun times.
What Haeckel said was this, that from conception, in your mother's womb during 9 months, when you were conceived, you were a jellyfish.
I'm pretty damn sure he didn't start with a jellyfish, but okay.
But then you became a fish. Then you became an amphibian. Then you became a reptile. Then you became a mammal, and you were only born human. Now, he went around Europe teaching this to people. Now, the theory speculates that in the development of the human embryo, it passes through the evolutionary stages that were encountered in the supposed evolution of man, and that it goes from being a protozoan to a worm to a fish to amphibian to mammal to human, so all in your mother's womb.
No jellyfish this time, huh? Cool.
Now, this was disproven long, long ago.
Yes it was, which is why I'm wondering why we're even talking about it. I feel like he wouldn't appreciate me criticizing his ideas because the flat earth is dumb, which it is, but he doesn't believe it either. Can we all agree Haeckel was very wrong about recapitulation?
But I wonder if these pictures look familiar to you.
Yep, they're Haeckel's drawings, which I'll agree shouldn't be used anymore because we have photographs which can make the same argument for evolution from embryology far better, and because the way embryological development also follows a nested hierarchy of adult morphology and genetics. And remember, recapitulation is wrong, but embryology still provides great evidence for evolution because of the way that embryological development also follows the nested hierarchy of adult morphology and genetics. It's almost like a third line of independent evidence pointing to universal common ancestry and evolution. Pretty neat, right?
Does anybody remember in school being shown those drawings right there? Because this is a picture of the original drawings of Ernst Haeckel.
I actually don't remember being shown this drawing, but that doesn't mean I wasn't.
And he was showing here, well, we all look very much the same at conception.
But as we develop, we become what we end up being here. But at the beginning, we're all exactly the same. Now, it's not true. It's been disproven long ago.
Oh, okay, here's a sheep, a pig, a turtle, a whale, and a human embryo. Can you tell which one is which? Probably not. Seems like it's more true than false that early on embryos of tetrapods really look like each other.
These drawings are totally faked. As a matter of fact, he stole the drawings of legitimate embryologists.
Wait, if they're fake, then they're not stolen legitimate drawings. If I stole someone's sketch of a real thing, that doesn't make the sketch fake. Once again, we're back to trouble with basic logic.
He himself took a pencil and an eraser and he erased some of the lines, he drew in other lines. This is an absolute fake. It's a fraud. It's a hoax. It's fantasy.
Oh, okay, so he went with the let me copy your homework, but I'll change it a bit so it doesn't look obvious route. Okay, whatever. I don't actually care to defend Haeckel, even though as far as I can tell, this accusation of copying has never actually been made anywhere in the literature.
Now, what's the truth about the drawings? He stole them, he intentionally changed them to fit his evolutionary theory, and the actual embryos are quite different from the diagrams. For example, up on top we see the drawings of Ernst Haeckel. Below we see photographs of these creatures as they actually look at the time that is supposed to be represented in the drawings. This comes from 1997, Dr. Richardson working in London. And, well, Haeckel's whole theory was just a fake, a fraud, a hoax, it's fantasy.
And that's where the Haeckel discussion mercifully ends.
And let's take a look at the law of biogenesis. You see, Haeckel's law was the biogenetic law, which is a fake, a fraud, a hoax, a fantasy. But let's take a look at the law of biogenesis. Now, what is the law of biogenesis, or it can be pronounced biogenesis?
Who else is sensing a conflation of spontaneous generation with abiogenesis coming up?
So, life only comes from life and only reproduces after its own kind. That life doesn't come from non-life, and life doesn't change into something else later.
Add modern in before life, and get rid of the kind thing, since that's a made-up nonsense term, and yeah, close enough.
Now, actually, the proof that life does not evolve and did not come from non-living material to living material.
Yeah, and no origin of life researchers think that the first life on Earth was a multicellular animal complete with a brain, digestive tract, wings, legs, etc. It was probably not even properly a cell. So why are we talking about this again?
By random chance, it started with experiments going back to Francesco Redi. Francesco Redi simply said in the day when people believed that flies spontaneously generated from rotting meat, simply did a little experiment. He took rotting meat, allowed flies to lay eggs, you got flies, you got maggots.
Those are separate propositions. Even if abiogenesis were impossible, evolution would still happen. Evolution is the inevitable result of having organisms who reproduce inexactly. It would happen even under a general or special creation scenario, in which life is created ex nihilo by God.
He took meat, he got it where the flies could smell it, but they couldn't get to it. They tried to lay eggs, but they couldn't get to the meat. But when he sealed the rotting meat completely where the flies couldn't even smell it, the flies didn't come anywhere near it. And unless flies lay eggs, you don't get maggots. It was that simple. Now, Louis Pasteur made it much, much more sophisticated. He took all the ingredients in food necessary for life, put them in a flask. It's what he called his swan-necked flask. He bent the glass so there's a long swan neck to it. He then pasteurized by boiling the material, but everything that was needed for life was there. And he left the end open to satisfy evolutionists.
You'd think he'd be a little bit more subtle about adding in the anti-evolution for no reason other than it helps him lie, but oh well.
Now, bacteria could float in the air, dust could float in the air and get to the bottom of the swan neck, but it couldn't crawl up the swan neck. And even though the tube was open to the air, if bacteria could not get to the broth, nothing ever developed. And he proved that life only comes from life and only reproduces after its own kind.
No, he was disproving spontaneous generation, which is an explicitly supernaturalist, not evolutionary idea. The idea is that there is a vital energy which escapes from life when it dies, but can then go on to create more life, whether relatively simple bacteria or even complex animals like maggots or mice. It had nothing to do with abiogenesis research or with evolutionary biology whatsoever.
How does the law of biogenesis contradict the various theories of evolution? Well,
by not doing so. I guess that's it for the series. I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, fine. He's not done. I'll do the rest of it.
The laws of biogenesis, that life only comes from life and only reproduces after its own kind, is the truth.
Again, this kind of thing is just something Grady's making up here. It's not a real thing in science.
Evolutionists propose that small inorganic molecules combine to form amino acids, and amino acids, proteins, and eventually living cells, but
no, that would be abiogenesis, and it actually starts with organic chemicals, which we know for a fact can and do form amino acids, RNA, and once that RNA is going, it can catalyze its own reproduction, as well as the formation of amino acid polymers, which are basically, proteins.
I think it's quite interesting. And then you have a textbook in chapter 3 on a general textbook on science. It will say spontaneous generation has been proven to not occur. And in chapter 16 it says, but evolution is true.
Correct.
The textbook contradicts itself.
I wonder if he often gets confused when people say that two things are true at the same time, when those things are in no way contradictory. If anyone here ever meets him, ask him how he feels about the fact that cars need fuel and that solar panels do not need fuel. If he's consistent, it should be utterly baffling to him.
There really are only two supposed causes of inanimate objects coming to life. The first one, of course, would be Pinocchio.
Right, magic, like special creation. Odd that the creationist would make that comparison, but sure, whatever.
And the other one would, of course, be Frosty the Snowman.
Wow, even I'm not usually this mean to creationism. I wonder if Grady is okay.
However, most scientists consider these two reports to be false.
Right in line with creationism being rejected as pseudoscience.
How close have scientists come to creating life?
Not very, since none of them are really trying. There's a whole lot of ethical issues with even the attempt, and it's not really necessary to investigate abiogenesis to try. Further, we don't currently know enough about the process to really have a good idea how to go about doing it. Because yes, abiogenesis is still very much an open question in science, and it's not clear if or when we'd know enough to attempt to recreate it. But it's also not clear at what point we could say that we had replicated it. Are reproducing strands of RNA that can undergo evolution on their own alive? In that case, then yes, scientists absolutely have created life. If not, then no, probably not. But any point where you say this is the cutoff of what life is going to be fundamentally arbitrary. And I can just as well use a broader definition and say that yes, life has been created. It's reasons like this why origin of life researchers aren't really interested in trying to recreate abiogenesis in full. It's not even clear what it would mean to try.
Well, the law of biogenesis, or biogenesis, means the law of life beginnings. It's the truth. It's the real law.
I am the law
of life beginning. Now, Louis Pasteur, a great creation-believing scientist, was one of the major people involved in developing the law of biogenesis. But the law of biogenesis basically says this. It basically says that life only comes from life and reproduces after its own kind. Well, not close at all. Think with me for just a moment. Producing 3 or 4 bricks is not the same thing as completing a skyscraper.
In part because skyscrapers aren't made of bricks, but if you could make a few bricks, then it's self-evident that you could indeed make a brick house with enough time and materials, which is why abiogenesis research tends to focus on making the things life is made of, like amino acids and sugars.
Even if scientists could synthesize life, it would not be non-living material spontaneously generating life. It would be an outside greater intelligence manipulating the material to get life.
Sorry, Grady, science doesn't operate on the heads you win, tails science loses principles, just to suit your ideological needs.
What are some of the problems that are encountered in synthesizing life? Well, the first problem is this. When chemists synthesize amino acids in a lab, they produce a 50-50 mixture of right and left-handed amino acids. It's called a race mix mixture.
Race mix? No, it's racemic. And oh look, Shisuke et al., 2004, found that a racemic mix of alanine, aspartic acid, arginine, glutamic acid, glutamine, histidine, leucine, methionine, serine, valine, phenylalanine, and tyrosine with an excess of racemic asparagine crystallized preferentially with other amino acids of the same handedness, showing nature to sort D and L amino acids.
But what that means is when they make amino acids, if you put the right things together, you get amino acids, but you get 50% right-handed, 50% left-handed. Now, chemically, they react exactly the same thing. The chemical formulas are written exactly the same way, but they're mirror images of each other. And now in nature, random chance produces a 50-50 mixture. That's nature.
Generally, yes, but if it makes some extra asparagine, suddenly it can deracemize the mixture.
Living proteins are formed from only left-handed amino acids and only use right-handed sugars. So let's think about this. Living systems use only left-handed amino acids, no right-handed ones, and they use only right-handed sugars, no left-handed sugars. As a matter of fact, if I take a right-handed amino acid and stick it in your body, you'll die.
I'm going to need a citation on that one, especially since the racemization of amino acids begins basically immediately on death of any organism, and generally speaking, humans almost exclusively eat dead things, whether it be plants, animals, or fungi. It doesn't matter. A regular part of the human diet includes traces of D-amino acids. In fact, this has in the last 35 years or so allowed scientists to develop new dating techniques for organic remains, amino acid dating, in which the ratio of D and L amino acids is measured, and from that, an estimate of the time of the organism's death to the present is calculated.
If I just add one right-handed amino acid, it will produce death.
Says the man who's been eating them his whole life.
But what is also interesting about death is there's something special about life. Because you see, in the time that you're alive, your body has only left-handed amino acids and uses only right-handed sugars. But the instant you die, in your body, these amino acids start reverting to 50-50.
Are you kidding me? He knows this. And he's going to pretend that just having one D amino acid in his body is going to kill someone? Is Grady secretly a lizard person who only eats live food? How is Grady a real person who exists?
There's something special about life. There's something special where you have only 100% left-handed amino acids and use only right-handed sugars, and adding one or the other opposite ones will kill you.
That's a big if, and it's not true, so I don't know. I do think life is special, but not for this reason. Mostly because this reason isn't true.
The simplest living systems are far more complex than any single amino acid, of course.
Well, yeah, given that living things are in part made of amino acids, they'd have to be.
And when you die, they break back down to 50-50. Now, I'd like to know any evolutionist that can tell me what filter in nature that by random chance would take 50% the right-handed ones out of the mixture and leave only the left-handed ones.
Preferential crystallization, which is a known phenomenon that I've already referenced. Now, is this the actual way abiogenesis happened? I don't know. But it at least means that we have options for natural deracemization.
Or to keep only the right and get rid of the left. Please explain to me where that happens.
In racemic mixtures with an excess of asparagine.
So is life just chemistry? Well, life is made out of atoms, molecules, solutions, chemical reactions. That's true.
It's also, I would argue, a sustained system which maintains thermodynamic disequilibrium with the environment, and that the difference between being alive and being dead is ultimately down to the ability to maintain this thermodynamic disequilibrium. But Grady has shown he has no clue about even the basics of thermodynamics, so perhaps that would go over his fat head.
However, when one dies, these chemicals are still there, although they do start to revert to 50-50, and in case of amino acids, for instance. Thus, we can say that life is more than chemistry, because if I took all of the chemicals in a human body and simply poured it on the floor, it wouldn't form a human body.
No, it wouldn't, nor likely anything else of note besides a mess. But that's because there's no way for that system to maintain a thermodynamic disequilibrium with the environment, which allows it to take advantage of energy gradients to do the work of biology. Instead, it's just a cool mess of organic molecules.
And what about taxonomy? Now, taxonomy is the ability to pigeonhole, label things, and so forth. Some of you will remember some of this. It's the classification system for naming creatures. For example, there are 7 chief groups in the scientific system of classification, from kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species.
And it's important to remember that all these ranks are fundamentally arbitrary. They all have intermediary ranks not usually taught to school children, like sub and superphylum, infraorder, superfamily, etc. And even these ranks are arbitrary and have numerous unranked groups between them. And why is this? Well, it's because of evolution, fundamentally. But let's hear what Grady has to say about it.
Well, how does the ability to classify plants and animals confirm genesis? Well, think with me for a second. You know, the numerous clear-cut gaps which we do see between plants and animal kinds today that do allow plants and animals to be classified, pigeonholed, and say this is a dog and that is a cat and this is a rose, well, that's evidence of creation of separate kinds.
It would be if they weren't then grouped into higher groupings that just keep nesting. Designed objects can be fit into basic categories, yes, but they don't objectively nest in multiple otherwise independent ways. That's something only descent with modification does. It does it in organisms, and it does it in languages. It even does it in manuscripts, like biblical manuscripts. Textual experts can reconstruct ancestral texts, recognize scribal emendations and errors based on the nested hierarchy and the knowledge that until the printing press was invented, texts indeed were produced by reproduction of the text, with introduced errors that could be inherited by text copied from the copy. The same kind of techniques used to construct manuscript families can be used to construct organism families, and when you do it with morphology, with embryology, and with genetics, the shape of the family tree that you recover shows an amazing correspondence. Now try doing this with books as a whole. Maybe we start with genre. We can put the genres into fiction and non-fiction. Sure, but let's look at fiction. There are numerous subgenres. Fiction is one taxon, and sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, thriller, romance, etc. are genres within the fiction. Okay, so then we look at what type of book it is. Narrative, poem, novel, novella, short story collection, encyclopedia, etc. But wait, those aren't distributed according to a nested hierarchy. A sci-fi book could be any of them, but so could a fantasy book or a romance book. So while we have some nesting, we can't carry that all the way down. You could try using perhaps publishers, but then many publishers cross genres, even though some do not. But maybe we could put publishers above the fiction non-fiction. But then the nesting hierarchy falls apart below that simply because, again, publishers cross genres. You can come up with a classification scheme for books, but it can't be made to nest in any objective manner, specifically because books are intelligently designed, and they can borrow any element they want from other books, with no regard for the ancestry that does not exist between them. That is the prediction of special creation with intelligent design, because that is the hallmark of intelligently designed things. If creationism were true, we should not expect any classification system with a hierarchy to be objectively better than any other when it comes to living things, at least beyond the alleged kinds, which interestingly enough would actually be pretty obvious in such a case. In that case, the kinds would be reasonably easily determined by looking for a group of organisms that can be fit into a nested hierarchy, because of their common descent, but could not be fit into any larger such nested hierarchies.
If evolution were true, then we would expect to have a mush of things, this tree of life concept that says things are constantly evolving into existence. I'd have a mush from one kind into the next. I shouldn't be able to say, this is a dog, this is a cat. I shouldn't be able to say, this is an animal, that's a plant.
No, because that's not how branching works. Once two organisms split from a common ancestor, presuming neither lineage goes extinct, they will become more and more distinct. That's why the earliest members of related groups look more like each other than modern members of those groups do. For example, the first Sirenians and the first Proboscideans are nearly identical, and the first horses and the first ceratomorphs are nearly identical. Whereas today, no one is likely to confuse a rhinoceros or a tapir for a horse. In dinosaurs, it's not clear if some of the earliest dinosaurs were more closely related to theropods or sauropods, or neither. Whereas if you look at, say, the Cretaceous, no one will be confusing Titanosaurus for Velociraptor. But evolution and special creation predict very distinct groups. The difference is that evolution predicts a nested hierarchy, whereas special creation predicts no hierarchy that can be found objectively beyond the kind.
But what kind it is, I couldn't say, because if it's halfway from this to that, how can you label it?
Because clades erupt within groups. While everything is transitional between its ancestor and its descendants, a canine can't cross into being a feline. It can only become a new variety of canine, and when a canine becomes a wolf, it can't turn into a fox, just turn into new varieties of wolf. The same thing happens with languages. No one would likely confuse Romanian for Spanish or English for Dutch, yet Romanian and Spanish share a common ancestor in Latin, and Dutch and English also do in Proto-West Germanic. But they all four share a common ancestor in what might be called Proto-West Indo-European, or perhaps even Proto-European. And such languages also share a common ancestor in Proto-Indo-European with languages like Nepali, Farsi, and Hindi, which themselves share a common ancestor in Proto-Indo-Iranian. No one really disputes the common ancestry and evolutionary history of these languages, and yet most people would, even without much knowledge of linguistics, be able to hear people speaking Dutch, English, Farsi, Hindi, Romanian, Nepali, and Spanish, and at least pick out that 7 languages are being spoken without too much trouble.
What about variations in natural selection? Well, these are variations in dogs. Those are different kinds of dogs, but nature would never produce any of those dogs.
That's probably true. Humans use artificial selection to produce dog breeds, and in doing so, they mostly hyper-focused on certain traits while ignoring the rest of the animal, resulting in many dog breeds with severe health problems that would probably mean they wouldn't do well without the highly unusual environment of human society to support their continued existence. Natural selection cannot simply hyper-focus, because anything that causes a net fitness decrease will be selected against, even if it's otherwise something you might think of as cool, and it operates on all aspects of an organism. Natural selection doesn't care if the trait is biochemical, coloration, gross morphology, or what. If it's bad for reproductive output, it's selected against, and if it's good for reproductive output, it's selected for. In this way, evolution sculpts whole organisms at a time. It does not simply create dogs with cute but not very healthy brachycephalic faces, or a majestic coat of fur but horrible hip dysplasia at a young age.
I mean, think about it. You can take a pair of Heinz 57 dogs, or I do mission work in Brazil. I learned a new term for a Heinz 57 dog. They call it a street special. But think about it. Random chance mating of dogs, cats, and so forth in nature will just give you mongrels. It takes human intelligence to get terriers and collies and whippets and so forth. Is that right?
Yeah, but not wolves, and coyotes, and dholes, and jackals, and foxes, and tanukis. Nature does those just fine.
Now, today we now know that wolves, dogs, are one kind. Dogs and wolves can mate. As a matter of fact, we now know that coyotes, dogs, wolves can all mate. So what was the original dog anyway?
Something like Hesperocyan, which interestingly is nearly identical to Mustelacetus, a basal arctoidean, a group that today includes weasels, skunks, seals, bears, and raccoons. Weird how when you go back in time you get the ancestors of distinct modern groups being very similar, much like how evolution might predict.
Variation within cats. All these cats look different, but they're all cats.
Hey, look at all these vertebrates that look different, but they're all vertebrates. I guess humans and chimps and snakes and sharks are all the same kind.
And what about microevolution versus macro? The variation within the kind versus the jump from one kind to another?
Yeah, that's not what that is. If you want to critique a scientific idea, you need to understand it. And part of that is that you don't simply get to redefine technical terms in a field in question. Microevolution is and has always been evolution below the species level, and macroevolution is evolution at or above the species level. So when the common ancestor of wolves and coyotes split, that was macroevolution. It has nothing to do with kinds, for the very good reason that that's not a thing in evolutionary biology. It is a creationist weasel word used to confuse things rather than to communicate clearly. We can tell because there's never any good way to show what it would even mean for an organism to change from one kind to another.
Well, microevolution, which is really de-evolution.
De-evolution isn't really a thing. Once you evolve, you can't really go back, with extremely few exceptions, such as the repair of a pseudogene that was only broken in a relatively small way, or the return of a Hox gene to a state closer to the ancestral state. But this is vanishingly rare, and the longer the time goes, the less likely it becomes.
Is small-scale biological lateral downward shifts or variations.
Fun fact, lateral isn't the same as downward. In fact, they're orthogonal to each other. But also, evolution doesn't have an up or down. It has adaptation to the environment. That it might do that in a way that humans do or do not like doesn't mean evolution is going up or down.
Such as color, size, the shape of nose, shape of ear. Macroevolution would involve large-scale biological changes from one kind to another, such as fish becoming amphibians, amphibians becoming reptiles, reptiles becoming mammals, birds, humans, and so forth.
Well, that would be macroevolution, yes, but fundamentally that's also about manipulating the shape and size of pre-existing organs while changing biochemistry. It's just the same as the microevolution that Grady accepts, but, lots of it. A human has the same basic bones and organs as a frog, but they're in different sizes and shapes, and the human has some distinct biochemistry. But these are things that microevolution accomplishes. Grady is basically just saying that you can't use the same process that you use to walk to the corner store to walk 5 kilometers. That is, putting one foot in front of the other and repeating. But we all know that that's exactly how you walk 5 kilometers, by taking the same kind of steps that gets you to the corner store.
Now, many of you would be familiar with the Galapagos finches, that when Charles Darwin arrived in the Galapagos, he actually cataloged 13 different varieties.
Technically, they're tanagers, but I think only myself and Jackson Wheat really care about that.
So he cataloged 13 different varieties of finches. He said, based on the size of the beak and the shape of the beak and so forth. But genetic studies have been done recently that prove that all 13 varieties of finches are one species. It's just 13 varieties of one species.
It's no different than you can have 6.7 billion people on Earth and they all look different from each other, but they're all people.
Well, that's just a lie. There's no citation, of course, because no, the consensus on the birds commonly called Darwin's finches isn't that they're all the same species. They're not even all the same genus. There are 5 separate genera. There's Geospiza, Camarhynchus, Platyspiza, Certhidia, and Pinarolaxius. Between these genera, there are 18 species. The entire point is just completely wrong.
And again, this is a 5-legged cow. Now, this 5th leg right here, is it beneficial to the cow?
Probably not. No.
And tell me something, is this new information coming into existence by random chance?
No, in fact, it's not even likely a genetic change. It's more likely a result of a fetus that started to split into twins, but it didn't really work, and then the twin was partially resorbed, leaving behind a supernumerary leg. That's how this normally happens in tetrapods.
Or is this simply the accidental duplication of previously existing information?
Also no, because again, this isn't a genetic change. It's like he tries to be as wrong as possible.
Well, I think you'll agree. No new information was added here. The information for legs already existed. This is just a case of the accidental duplication of previously existing information.
No, it's a case of the use of the same genes again in a partial twinning scenario. It has nothing to do with a mutation duplicating leg genes. That doesn't even make sense. There are no genes that on their own are just make-a-leg genes that you can duplicate and then get extra legs. The developmental genes are all about gradient, splitting, folding, apoptosis, i.e. programmed cell death, etc. They're not blueprints that you could copy and then stick in a new place to get an extra structure. Grady is just showing that he knows absolutely nothing about the topic he's talking about, genetics and embryology.
Or what about these 3 sheep right here? I think the guy in the middle here, we'll call him Shorty. How's that?
Sure, why not?
Now, if you had that mutation right there, how long do you think you'd last in nature? I mean, think with me. The first time the wolves attacked, who's going to be dinner? Right?
None of those sheep could outrun a wolf, but yeah, it's not a mutation that will likely persist in the wild.
No new information was added. The information for legs was already there, but the information for long legs was lost, leaving only information for short legs.
That's not how it works. Leg length is determined genetically by the same exact genes in long and short-legged animals. The difference is how long the genes in question express. I'm not sure how what amounts to a different number on a timer means more or less information. Does the recipe that tells you to boil pasta for 3 minutes have less information than one that tells you to do it for 4 minutes? I don't see how. Further, this seems to imply that bigger means more information, but that is simply not true. An amoeba has a far larger genome than a blue whale. And would Grady really like to say that the Mbuti people of the Ituri rainforest in the Congo have way less information than, say, the Dutch? I mean, after all, the Mbuti are on average about half a meter shorter than the Dutch. Somehow, I doubt he'd say that, but clearly it's the implication of the idea that shortness or smallness means less information.
And in nature, that creature would never exist for very long, and it would not pass along this mutation to other sheep.
Probably not, no.
Reptiles are very prone to this, the accidental duplication of previously existing information. I mean, how many of you ever heard of, two-headed snakes, two-headed turtles, and so forth? Now, here we have a two-headed turtle.
Jesus Christ, this mother piece of just can't stop, can he? Again, it's conjoined twins. There was no duplication of head genes. If you breed that turtle, it won't have two-headed offspring, because it's a problem with embryonic development that isn't directly tied to some allele for two-headedness.
Now, first of all, in nature we would call that monstrous, because 2 heads is not right.
Oh, so he's a dick in addition to being a liar. Good to know. My apologies to anyone out there who was or is a conjoined twin for Grady implying that you're a monster. You're certainly not.
And I think you'll agree that this is, not a very good mutation.
Yeah, because it's not a mutation at all.
How long would that creature actually exist? Or two-headed snakes and so forth. They only exist because people then keep them in museum-type situations, a zoo and so forth, or in a home condition.
Yep, conjoined twins have a tough time without support from humans. This isn't really news, but okay. I'm also not sure what the point of showing off conjoined twins in animals is. It has very little to do with evolution, and it isn't an example of mutation by and large.
But they would never survive in nature.
Agreed.
Now, this is a pretty heady book. This is a college-level book on parasitology. However, it has a very interesting quote I want to share with you. Natural selection can act only on those biological properties that already exist. It cannot create properties in order to meet adaptational needs. According to evolution, the atheistic view,
Evolution is no more atheistic than the theory of universal gravitation. Neither use God as an explanatory mechanism, but neither does either have anything to say about the existence of a god or gods. Science isn't here to talk about God, just the natural world. If the fact that science is closing the gaps that you like to stuff God in bugs you, then just cope. Further, the majority of religious people accept evolution, including the majority of Christians, specifically.
Genetics doesn't allow to look into the future and say, oh, I need this, so I'll do this to get there. No, it has to be by random chance.
Yeah, basically.
Now, survival of the fittest does not explain the arrival of the fittest.
Right, that would be mutation that does that. Unfortunately, it seems like Grady doesn't even know what mutations are, since he can't tell the difference between a mutation and a partial twinning event.
Survival of the fittest is circular reasoning. I mean, actually, survival of the fittest is a meaningless terminology. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's actually true, and it is true in part because fitness isn't strictly about survival. It's about reproduction. If you live forever but never reproduce, you're not being selected for. It's also not really a phrase you'll see in the actual literature of evolutionary biology. It's more of a catchphrase popularizers came up with in the late 19th century than a principle or phrase in real science.
It has absolutely no value in science whatsoever, because think of it for a second. It's just a useless tautology, circular reasoning. Why did it survive? Well, because it's the fittest. How do you know it's the fittest? Because it survived. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It means absolutely nothing. It doesn't prove anything about evolution.
Yes, which is something everyone is well aware of in science, and is why it's not something scientists use.
And finally, think with me for just a moment.
I no longer think he's even capable of that. Every time he says that, he then goes on to make the most brain-dead statements imaginable. He might as well say, now ignore all logic and reality with me for a second.
Now, I know some of you may watch various natural history type programs and so forth on various TV stations and whatever.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
First of all, I will say this to you as a creationist. If you must watch these programs, please do me one favor and turn off the sound.
Yeah, we wouldn't want you learning any science or anything. Imagine telling curious people to just ignore expertise and stick their heads in the sand, lest they learn something that contradicts an absurd minority and frankly cultish take on the Bible.
There's nothing wrong with the pictures. As a matter of fact, some of these photographers are some of the greatest in the world. Animals really do play, they really do eat, they really do sleep, etc., and some of the photography is exceptionally good. Catches the animals exactly without them knowing there's any human around. And the pictures can be fine. What's wrong is the narrative. For example, how many of you have seen pictures of seals swimming gracefully through the water? And they're just playing. I mean, they're not hunting, they're just enjoying life and so forth. And they're swimming around and playing with each other and so forth. And the narrative says, oh, do you see how for millions of years these creatures evolved to swim so gracefully through the water?
I actually don't remember that. But then again, I'm not a paranoid religious extremist who's intentionally wrong about nearly everything, and who is hypervigilant for any science that contradicts my obviously nonsensical view of the history of the planet. So maybe I wouldn't.
I could take the exact same picture, change the narrative, and say, do you see how the Creator God designed these creatures to swim so gracefully through the water?
Yeah, but to do so, he'd be ignoring the actual genetic evidence linking pinnipeds to mustelids, mephitids, procyonids, ilurids, and even ursids, as well as ignore transitional pinnipeds showing how they evolved from land-dwelling carnivores, such as Samantur, Necromites, Potamotherium, Huihila, Enaliarctos, Pinarctidian, Pacificotaria, and Pteronarctos. That seems dishonest, or at least massively ill-informed. But then again, let's remember the triangle among well-informed, honest, and creationist. You get it best, too.
It's the same picture. It's just two different interpretations.
Yes, one interpretation that does not ignore most of the scientific data, the scientific interpretation, and one that does ignore most of the data, the creationist one.
And let's think for a second about this particular drawing. I mean, again, how many of you have seen these, underwater, say, photographies of natural conditions where you've seen seals or killer whales, and they find a school of fish. And what happens? Well, they find the school of fish, and the predators see the fish, and what happens is, working together, they start swimming around the school of fish. Now the fish see the predators out there, they know they're predators, and they want to get away. So if the predators start swimming in a circle, what happens? Well, the fish start swimming in a circle too, because they're trying to get away. And so what happens? Well, then the predators are very clever, you see, because God designed them that way.
Facts not in evidence.
Then they start getting a little closer and a little closer and a little closer, and the school of fish starts turning a little tighter, a little tighter, a little tighter, until suddenly it looks like a tornado of fish in the water. And then the seals, the killer whales, taking turns, one will turn at a time, go through the school with the jaws going like this, right? Now, think with me for just a second.
I wish I could. I really, really do.
Is this survival of the fittest? Or is this survival of the luckiest?
Hooray! Grady figured out genetic drift. He's only like 80 years late to the party or so. Congrats to him.
Well, it's survival of the luckiest. If you're in the way of those jaws, it doesn't matter whether you're the biggest, smartest animal in the school of fish. If you're in the way of those jaws, you're gone. And so survival of the fittest is a totally meaningless terminology. It doesn't mean anything. What does not prove evolution. Matter of fact, it refutes evolution.
I'd love to know how, but that music tells me he's about to end the talk without ever explaining it. Fun.
And so when evolutionists use these terms, survival of the fittest,
which as a rule, they don't,
you have to say, wait a minute, really? I don't think so.
Yes, instead talk about mutation, selection, drift, and differential reproductive success. You know, the things scientists in relevant fields to evolutionary biology actually talk about.
That once you realize the material that I've been sharing with you, you'll realize that survival of the fittest refutes evolution and proves creation.
And thus, finally, mercifully, he's done. I don't think I've ever seen an hour-long speech get that much wrong, that fast, and that obviously. Grady is giving Kent Hovind and Carl Baugh a run for their money for the title of the dumbest creationist professionals still living. I hope you enjoyed watching me suffer through this inanity, and if you did, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you're always notified when I have new content. Also, leave a comment for the algorithm telling me what you did or did not like. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Tapioca Weasel, Klaus Jepsen, Bent Hovind, Kevin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, San, Denny5252, Eleron Teller, Phil Havara, Ian Chen, Mrs. Spexinder, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Scriptic Mystic. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is. And perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.